All right, you read the title of the video, Terrorist Organization Iceberg. Let's do it. So first off, we're going to be talking about ISIS. And ISIS, or the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, also known as ISIL, is a jihadist militant group that has been one of the most notorious and brutal terrorist organizations of the 21st century. Its origins can be traced back to the early 2000s, evolving from the remnants of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which was founded by the Jordanian jihadist Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. After the US-led invasion of Iraq in 2003, al-Zarqawi established Al-Qaeda in Iraq and pledged allegiance to Osama bin Laden. However, Zarqawi's tactics, which included targeting Shia Muslims and instigating sectarian violence, were so extreme that they caused friction within Al-Qaeda's central leadership. Despite Zarqawi's death in 2006, Al-Qaeda in Iraq persisted under new leadership under Abu Ayyub al-Masri and Abu Omar al-Baghdadi, who declared the formation of the Islamic State of Iraq. The group capitalized on the chaos and disenfranchisement felt by Sunni communities in Iraq, especially during the sectarian conflicts that plagued the country. In 2010, Baghdadi took control over the Islamic State of Iraq, and under his leadership, they expanded its operations into Syria amidst the civil war that erupted in 2011. This expansion marked a significant shift, and by 2013, the group would rebrand itself as the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. They would rise to prominence in 2014 when they captured the Iraqi city of Mosul, and Baghdadi declared the establishment of a form of Islamic government led by Caliph, who was considered the political and religious successor to the Prophet Muhammad. Baghdadi appointed himself as the Caliph, calling on Muslims worldwide to pledge allegiance and migrate to territories under ISIS control. They implemented a stricter version of Sharia law in the areas they controlled, often carrying out brutal punishments such as beheadings, stonings, and amputations. Its propaganda efforts were sophisticated, using social media and other online platforms to recruit fighters globally and spread its message. At its height, ISIS controlled significant territories in Iraq and Syria, including major cities like Mosul, Raqqa, and Fallujah. The group's rapid territorial gains and the establishment of de facto state pose a significant threat to regional stability and global security, and ISIS's control over oil fields, extortion, and smuggling provided substantial revenue, making it one of the wealthiest terrorist organizations in history. Now, the international community would eventually respond with a coalition of forces led by the United States, which launched a sustained military campaign against ISIS. This coalition included countries from across the globe contributing to airstrikes, ground operations, and support for local forces. The battle against ISIS was marked by significant and brutal urban warfare. The campaigns to retake cities like Mosul resulted in widespread destruction and heavy civilian casualties. However, despite these challenges, by late 2017, ISIS had lost most of its territorial holdings. The Iraqi government would declare victory over ISIS in December of 2017 after the liberation of Mosul and other key areas. The defeat of ISIS in its last stronghold in Syria would be announced in 2019. Today, ISIS is largely viewed as a fragmented but persistent threat, and its core in Iraq and Syria operates more as an insurgency, conducting sporadic attacks aimed at destabilizing the region and undermining local governments. Alright, next up we have Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda is a global militant Islamist organization founded by Osama bin Laden, Abdullah Azzam, and several other militants in 1988. Its formation was rooted in the Afghan jihad against the Soviet invasion, during which bin Laden and Azzam played key roles in recruiting, financing, and training thousands of Muslim fighters from around the world to join the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. Osama bin Laden became increasingly radicalized during the 1980s. The success of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan bolstered his belief that Islam could be defended and expanded through militant means. Following the Soviet Union withdrawal in 1989, bin Laden would return to Saudi Arabia, but the presence of US troops during the Gulf War in 1990 to 1991 deeply angered him. He saw it as a desecration of Islamic holy lands and began to view the United States as the primary enemy of Islam. In the early 1990s, bin Laden would move to Sudan, where he established a base of operations with the support of the Sudanese government. During this period, Al-Qaeda expanded its network, establishing connections with various Islamist groups and conducting attacks, such as the 1992 bombing of a hotel in Yemen, which targeted US troops. International pressure would force bin Laden to leave Sudan in 1996, prompting his return to Afghanistan, where the Taliban, another militant Islamist group, had eventually gained control. Under Taliban protection, Al-Qaeda would begin to flourish. Bin Laden issued orders calling for attacks on U.S. interests, framing it as a defensive jihad against Western oppression of Muslims. Al-Qaeda's most notorious and devastating attack came on September 11, 2001. 19 Al-Qaeda operatives hijacked 4 commercial planes, crashing 2 into the World Trade Center towers in New York City, 1 into the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., and the 4th, intended for another high-profile target in Washington, D.C., crashed in Pennsylvania after passengers intervened. The 9/11 attacks killed nearly 3,000 people and prompted the United States to launch the War on Terror. In response, the U.S. would invade Afghanistan in October 2001, aiming to dismantle Al-Qaeda and remove the Taliban from power. Al-Qaeda's leadership, including bin Laden, went into hiding, with many fleeing to Pakistan. Despite initial disruption, Al-Qaeda adapted by decentralizing its structure, inspiring and coordinating with affiliated groups worldwide, carrying out numerous attacks including the 2004 Madrid train bombings, the 2005 London bombings, and various attacks in the Middle East and Africa. It wouldn't be until May 2011 when Osama bin Laden would be killed by U.S. Navy SEALs in Pakistan in a covert operation authorized by President Barack Obama. His death was a significant blow to Al-Qaeda, but the organization continued under the leadership of Ayman al-Zawahiri, who was bin Laden's longtime deputy. Al-Qaeda's strategy would then evolve to focus more on regional conflicts and insurgencies, positioning itself as the defender of Sunni Muslims in conflicts such as the Syrian civil war. Now today, Al-Qaeda is viewed more as a resilient and adaptive network, even as it operates in more fragmented and diffused manner. Alright, next up we have Boko Haram, and Boko Haram is a jihadist militant organization based in northeastern Nigeria. The group was founded in 2002 by Mohammed Yusuf, and Boko Haram quite literally translates to Western education is forbidden, and it emerged in opposition to Western-style education and the perceived corruption of the Nigerian government, advocating for the establishment of an Islamic state governed by Sharia law. Under Mohammed Yusuf's leadership, Boko Haram initially operated as a non-violent religious movement, attracting followers disillusioned with the Nigerian state's failure to provide services and governance, especially in the impoverished north. However, the group's ideology and activities became increasingly militant. In 2009, tensions between Boko Haram and Nigerian authorities culminated in a violent crackdown. Nigerian security forces would kill hundreds of Boko Haram members and captured Yusuf, who later died in police custody under suspicious circumstances. The death of Yusuf would mark a turning point for Boko Haram, leading to a more radical and violent phase under the new leadership of Abu Bakr Shako. Shako, known for his brutal tactics and uncompromising stance, transformed Boko Haram into a full-fledged insurgent group. The group began carrying out a series of increasingly deadly attacks, including bombings, assassinations, and kidnappings, targeting government officials, security forces, and civilians. One of the most significant escalations in Boko Haram's campaign occurred in 2011 when it attacked the United Nations headquarters in Abuja, killing 23 people and injuring over 80. This marked Boko Haram's first major attack on an international target. The group's notoriety would further increase with the abduction of over 270 schoolgirls from Chibok in April of 2014, sparking global outrage. By 2014, the group had seized control over large territories in northeastern Nigeria, declaring a caliphate in the town of Gwoza. The group's territorial ambitions and brutal governance, characterized by mass killings, forced conversions, and the imposition of a strict interpretation of Sharia law, drew comparisons to ISIS. This alignment was formalized in March of 2015 when Shako pledged allegiance to ISIS and Boko Haram was rebranded as the Islamic State's West Africa province. However, despite this allegiance, internal divisions would soon emerge. In 2016, ISIS recognized Abu Musab Barnawi, who was the son of Boko Haram's founder Mohammed Yusuf, as the new leader of the Islamic State's West Africa province, which sidelined Shako, and this led to a split, with Shako's faction continuing to operate independently, often referring to themselves as Boko Haram, and al-Barnawi's faction focused more on winning the support of local populations and targeting military and government installations rather than civilians. Boko Haram's insurgency would have devastating effects on Nigeria and the Lake Chad Basin region, which resulted in the deaths of over 30,000 people and displaced displaced millions, creating one of the world's most severe humanitarian crises. The Nigerian government, along with regional military forces and international partners, has launched numerous operations to combat Boko Haram and the Islamic State in West Africa province, achieving varying degrees of success. And in recent years, the Nigerian military has reclaimed much of the territory previously held by Boko Haram, but the group remains a potent threat. Sheko's faction continues to carry out suicide bombings, raids, and kidnappings, particularly targeting soft targets like schools, markets, and mosques. The Islamic State in West Africa province, under al-Barnawi's leadership, has also maintained a significant presence in the Lake Chad region, conducting sophisticated attacks on military bases and personnel. Alright, next up we have the Taliban, and the Taliban is a fundamentalist Islamic militia that emerged in the early 1990s amidst the chaos of the Afghan civil war that followed the withdrawal of Soviet forces. The group's roots lie in the Afghan Mujahideen fighters who had resisted the Soviet occupation during the 1980s, may or may have not had support from the CIA. It's not my, it's not my position to say so. Right. Anyways, many of the Taliban's founding members were former Mujahideen, but the movement itself originated in religious seminaries in Pakistan. Mullah Muhammad Omar, a former Mujahideen commander, founded the Taliban in 1994, promising to restore peace and enforce a strict interpretation of Sharia law. The Taliban rapidly gained popular support by pledging to end the rampant corruption, restore security, and implement Islamic law, and within a year, the Taliban had captured Kandahar and began their advance on the Afghan capital, Kabul. By September 1996, the Taliban had seized Kabul and established the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, with Mullah Omar as the de facto head of state. The Taliban's rule was marked by the implementation of a version of Sharia law which included severe restrictions on women's rights, the banning of music and television, and harsh punishments for those who violated their codes. During their rule from 1996 to 2001, the Taliban provided sanctuary to various militant groups, most notably Al-Qaeda, led by Osama bin Laden. The relationship between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda became a focal point of international concern, particularly after the 1998 bombings of U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, which were orchestrated by Al-Qaeda. The Taliban's refusal to extradite bin Laden following these attacks would further strain relations with the United States and the international community, and the turning point would come on September 11, 2001. Now, after 9/11, the US, backed by a coalition of international forces, launched Operation Enduring Freedom in October of 2001, aimed at dismantling Al-Qaeda and overthrowing the Taliban regime. By December of 2001, the Taliban government had collapsed, and its leaders had either been killed, captured, or had fled to rural areas or across the border to Pakistan. The Taliban would eventually reorganize as an insurgent group, waging a guerrilla war against the new Afghan government and NATO-led coalition forces. Mullah Omar remained the leader until his death, which was kept secret for several years and only announced in 2015. The Taliban's insurgency would involve suicide bombings, ambushes, and targeted assassinations aimed at destabilizing the Afghan government and regaining control. Despite the sustained international military presence, the Taliban proved resilient, leveraging local grievances, tribal dynamics, and sanctuaries in Pakistan's tribal areas to maintain their insurgency. They financed their operations through various means, including the opium trade, extortion, and external funding from sympathizers. And efforts to bring the Taliban to the negotiating table began in the late 2010s with various rounds of talks facilitated by countries like Qatar, Pakistan, and Russia. And these efforts culminated in the Doha Agreement signed in February 2020 between the Taliban and the United States, which outlined the withdrawal of US and NATO troops in exchange for the Taliban's commitment to prevent terrorist groups from using Afghan soil to threaten the US and its allies. The US and NATO forces began their withdrawal in 2021, and the Taliban would then lead and launch an extensive offensive, rapidly capturing provincial capitals and major cities. And by August of 2021, the Taliban had entered Kabul, leading to the collapse of the Afghan government and the return of the Taliban to power. The swift takeover caught many by surprise, prompted chaotic scenes as thousands of Afghans and foreigners tried to flee the country. Since regaining control, the Taliban have re-established the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, and their return to power has raised significant concerns regarding human rights, particularly women's rights and the potential resurgence of terrorist groups within Afghanistan. However, the Taliban have promised to govern more moderately than the previous rule, but reports of human rights abuses and restrictions have continued to emerge. Alright, next up we have Hamas, and Hamas, or the Islamic Resistance Movement, is a Palestinian Islamist militant organization that has played a significant role in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Founded in 1987 during the First Intifada, which was a Palestinian uprising against Israeli occupation, Hamas emerged as an offshoot of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. Its formation was rooted in the frustration and disillusionment of many Palestinians with the perceived ineffectiveness of secular nationalist movements such as Fatah or PNLM in achieving Palestinian aspirations. The group's founding charter, published in 1988, called for the destruction of Israel and the establishment of an Islamic State in historic Palestine. It espoused a radical Islamist ideology blending Palestinian nationalism with Islamic fundamentalism. The charter also expressed opposition to the peace progress, rejecting any negotiated settlement with Israel. Hamas quickly gained popularity among Palestinians by providing extensive social services, including education, healthcare, and welfare programs, particularly in impoverished areas neglected by the current Palestinian Authority. Simultaneously, Hamas's military wing engaged in armed resistance against Israel, conducting numerous attacks including suicide bombings, rocket attacks, and kidnappings, which led to significant casualties and damage. The Oslo Accords of the 1990s, which aimed at establishing peace between Israelis and Palestinians, was largely opposed by Hamas. While the accords led to the creation of the Palestinian Authority and promised eventual Palestinian statehood, Hamas saw it as a betrayal of Palestinian rights and a capitulation to Israeli demands. The group's military activities intensified during this period, seeking to undermine the peace progress and challenge the leadership of the Palestinian Authority. In the 2006 Palestinian legislative elections, Hamas would achieve a surprising victory, securing a majority of seats in the Palestinian Legislative Council, and this was attributed to widespread dissatisfaction with Fatah, which was the dominant party in the Palestinian Authority and was plagued by corruption and inefficiency. Hamas's victory created a significant political dilemma for the international community, especially for Western countries and Israel, which had long viewed Hamas as a terrorist organization. Following the elections, tensions between Hamas and Fatah escalated, leading to a violent conflict in 2007. The power struggle culminated in Hamas's forcible takeover of the Gaza Strip, outing Fatah and establishing de facto control over the territory, and the division resulted in two separate Palestinian administrations, Hamas in Gaza and the Palestinian Authority, dominated by Fatah in the West Bank. Since taking control of Gaza, Hamas has faced numerous challenges, including Israeli blockades, economic hardships, and internal dissent. The group's governance in Gaza has been marked by a blend of authoritarian rule and efforts to maintain social services. And despite international isolation and sanctions, Hamas has managed to retain significant support among Gazans, partly due to its continued resistance against Israel. Now, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict would see several major escalations involving Hamas, as in December of 2008, Israel would launch Operation Cast Lead in response to persistent rocket fire from Gaza, resulting in extensive casualties and destruction in Gaza. Similar large-scale conflicts occurred in 2012, which was the Operation of Pillar Defense, and in 2014, Operation Protective Edge, each causing significant loss of life and infrastructure damage in Gaza, while also leading to casualties in Israel. Throughout these conflicts, Hamas utilized various tactics, including launching rockets into Israeli territory, deploying tunnels for smuggling and military operations, and engaging in guerrilla warfare. And Israel's military responses often included airstrikes, ground invasions, and targeted assassinations of Hamas leaders, which led to the deaths of Hamas militants as well as Palestinian civilians. Despite multiple ceasefires and attempts at peace negotiations, the conflict between Hamas and Israel remains unresolved, and the humanitarian situation in Gaza continues to deteriorate, exacerbated by the blockade imposed by Israel and Egypt, internal Palestinian political divisions, and periodic escalations of violence. All right, next up we have the Ku Klux Klan. And the Ku Klux Klan, or the KKK, is a white supremacist organization that has operated in the United States since the late 19th century. And it is notorious for its campaigns of terror, intimidation, and violence against African Americans and other minority groups. The Klan was founded in 1865 in Pulaski, Tennessee by a group of Confederate veterans led by Nathan Bedford Forrest. The original iteration of the Klan emerged during the Reconstruction era, which was a time when the federal government sought to rebuild the South and integrate formerly enslaved African Americans into society. The Klan's primary goal was to maintain white supremacy and undermine the political and social progress of African Americans. Members of the Klan used terror tactics including lynchings, beatings, and arson to intimidate African Americans and prevent them from exercising their civil rights such as voting. However, by the mid-1870s, the Klan had largely disbanded due to its federal crackdown and internal disorganization. The second iteration of the Klan was founded in 1915 by William J. Simmons in Georgia, inspired by the release of the film Birth of a Nation, which glorified the original Klan. This iteration expanded its targets beyond African Americans to include Jews, Catholics, immigrants, and other minority groups. It promoted itself as defenders of Americanism and Protestant Christian values, and the second Klan grew rapidly, reaching an estimated membership of 4 to 5 million by the mid-1920s. It was organized hierarchically with national, state, and local levels and held significant political influence in some areas. The influence, however, waned by the late 1920s due to internal power struggles, financial scandals, and increased public scrutiny. And by the 1930s, the second iteration of the Klan had largely disintegrated. The third iteration would emerge during the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, in which the Klan sought to resist the civil rights movement and maintain the system of racial segregation and white supremacy in the South. This iteration was responsible for numerous acts of violence, including bombings, murders, and beatings targeting civil rights activists. High-profile incidents such as the bombing of 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963, which killed 4 young African-American girls, drew national and international condemnation. Federal and state law agencies, along with civil rights organizations, worked to combat the Klan's influence and bring its members to justice, leading to a decline in its activities and membership by the late 20th century. Today, however, the Klan still exists as a fragmented and largely marginalized movement with numerous splinter groups and factions rather than a unified organization. These groups continue to espouse white supremacist and nativist ideologies, but their influence is limited compared to their peak periods, and the Klan's membership is estimated to be in the low thousands. All right, next up we got the Rajneesh Movement. And the Rajneesh Movement, also known as the Osho Movement, is a spiritual and controversial movement founded by the Indian mystic Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, later known as Osho. The movement originated in the 1970s in India and gained international attention during the 1980s when it established a large commune in Oregon, USA. Rajneesh, born in 1931 in India, started his career as a philosophy professor before becoming a spiritual teacher. In the late 1960s, he started attracting followers with his discourses on meditation, sexuality, and the rejection of traditional religious and societal norms. Rajneesh emphasized his importance of individual experience and self-realization, encouraging a blend of Eastern spirituality with Western philosophy. His teachings often criticized organized religion and traditional morality, promoting instead a vision of personal freedom and enlightenment. In the early 1970s, Rajneesh established an ashram in Pune, India, which became a thriving center for his teachings and practices. It attracted thousands of followers, including many Westerners, and became known for its eclectic blend of meditation techniques, therapies, and controversial practices. By the late 1970s, his movement faced increasing scrutiny from the Indian government and media, leading to legal challenges and financial pressures. And in response, Rajneesh and his followers sought to establish a new commune in the United States. In 1981, they purchased a large tract of land in Wisco County, Oregon, and established Rajneeshpuram, a self-sufficient community intended to house thousands of followers. And Rajneeshpuram quickly became a focal point of controversy and conflict. The rapid development of the commune and its secretive nature and the influx of thousands of followers alarmed local residents and authorities. Tensions escalated as the Rajneeshes, led by Ma Anand Sheela, his personal secretary and de facto leader of the commune, clashed with local government officials and residents. The conflict would reach its peak in the mid-1980s with a series of legal battles, allegations of illegal activities, and violent confrontations. In 1984, Rajneesh operatives were implicated in the largest bioterror attack in U.S. history when they intentionally contaminated salad bars in Oregon with salmonella bacteria, sickening over 700 people. and this act was a part of a broader effort to influence local elections and ensure control over Wesco County. After investigations intensified, Sheila and several top aides fled the commune in 1985, leading to their arrest and conviction on charges including attempted murder, assault, and immigration fraud. Rajneesh himself was arrested later that year and charged with immigration violations. He would enter a plea bargain and agreed to leave the United States, and he was deported and spent the next few years traveling to various countries before returning to India in 1987. Following his death, the movement persisted, with the India ashram remaining a major center for his teachings. The legacy of his movement is complex and multifaceted, as while Rajneesh's teachings on meditation and personal freedom have had a lasting impact and continue to attract followers, the controversies and criminal activities associated with Rajneesh Puram have cast a long shadow over the movement. All right, next up we have the Provisional IRA, and the Provisional IRA, or the Provisional Irish Republican Army, was an Irish Republican paramilitary organization that sought to end British rule in Northern Ireland and reunify Ireland. The group emerged in December 1969 following a split within the IRA, which had been dormant since the 1950s, and the split was driven by dissatisfaction with the existing IRA leaderships and failure to protect the Catholic nationalist community from loyalist attacks during the escalating sectarian conflict known as the Troubles. Now, the Troubles began in the late 1960s as a civil rights movement among Northern Ireland's Catholic minority, who faced discrimination in housing, employment, and voting rights. Tensions would then escalate into violent clashes between Catholics and Protestants, leading to increased intervention by British security forces. The Provisional IRA positioned itself as defenders of the Catholic nationalist community, committing to armed struggle against British forces and loyalist paramilitaries. The Provisional IRA's military strategy included guerrilla warfare tactics such as bombings, assassinations, ambushes, and sniper attacks. One of their earliest and most notorious operations was the bombing campaign in London and other British cities in the early 1970s, aimed at bringing the conflict to the British mainland. This period saw high-profile attacks such as the 1972 Bloody Friday bombings in Belfast, which involved multiple car bombings within a short period, resulting in significant casualties and widespread panic. The Provisional IRA's campaign resulted in a prolonged and violent conflict with thousands of deaths and injuries on both sides. High-profile incidents included the assassination of Lord Mountbatten in 1979, the Brighton Hotel bombing in 1984, and numerous attacks on British military and police personnel. The conflict also saw retaliated violence from loyalist paramilitaries and severe responses from British security forces, with controversial operations such as Bloody Sunday in 1972, where British soldiers killed 14 unarmed civil rights protesters. And throughout the 1980s and 1990s, political efforts to resolve the conflict would gain momentum, leading to the Anglo-Irish Agreement of 1985, which gave the Irish government an advisory role in Northern Irish affairs, and the Downing Street Declaration of 1993, which laid the groundwork for inclusive peace talks. The Provisional IRA declared a ceasefire in 1994, marking a significant shift towards a political resolution, and the ceasefire facilitated the multi-party negotiations that led to the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. The agreement, endorsed by the referendums in both Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, established a government for Northern Ireland with power-sharing arrangements between Unionists and Nationalists. It also included provisions for the decommissioning of paramilitary weapons and the release of political prisoners. Following the Good Friday Agreement, the Provisional IRA officially ended its armed campaign in 2005 and committed to the decommissioning of its weapons under international supervision. All right, next up we have the Kurdistan Workers' Party, and the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or PKK, is a Kurdish militant and political organization that has been involved in an armed struggle against the Turkish state since the late 1970s. The group aims to achieve greater autonomy and rights for Kurdish people in Turkey, and over time it has adapted its goals and strategies in response to changing political and military contexts. The PKK was founded in 1978 by Abdullah Öcalan and a group of Kurdish militants in the village of Fis in southeastern Turkey. Initially, the PKK's ideology was rooted in Marxism-Leninism and sought to establish an independent Kurdish state encompassing parts of Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran, where Kurdish populations are significant. The PKK's early activities included recruiting and training militants, organizing political activities, and engaging in propaganda to garner support among Kurds. The armed conflict between the PKK and the Turkish state would begin in 1984 when the PKK launched its first major attacks on Turkish military and police targets terrorists. This marked the beginning of a bloody insurgency. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, the conflict intensified, with the PKK conducting guerrilla warfare, bombings, and assassinations, while the Turkish military responded with heavy-handed counterinsurgency operations, including mass arrests, village evacuations, and widespread human rights abuses. Abdullah Öcalan, the charismatic leader of the PKK, was a central figure throughout this period. Öcalan operated from various locations in the Middle East, including Syria and Lebanon, where he received support from sympathetic governments and organizations, and the external support was crucial in sustaining the PKK's operations. The conflict reached the peak in the 1990s, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. The Turkish government designated the PKK as a terrorist organization, a classification echoed by the United States, European Union, and several other countries. And this designation was based on the PKK's use of violence and its attacks on civilians, which drew international condemnation. In 1999, Abdullah Öcalan would be captured by Turkish security forces in Nairobi, Kenya, in a covert operation. His capture was a significant blow to the PKK, and he was sentenced to death, which would later be changed to life imprisonment. Following his capture, Öcalan called for a ceasefire and a shift in the PKK's goals, from seeking full independence to demanding greater autonomy and cultural rights within Turkey. Despite his calls for peace, the conflict continued, with periods of intense fighting interspersed with ceasefires and attempts at negotiations. The early 2000s saw the PKK rebranding itself as the Kurdistan Freedom and Democracy Congress, and later as the Kurdistan People's Congress. However, these changes did little to alter its fundamental structure and objectives. The conflict between the PKK and the Turkish state saw a resurgence in violence in the mid-2000s and again in the 2010s, despite intermittent peace talks and ceasefires, and one of the most significant attempts at peace occurred in 2013, when the Turkish government and the PKK engaged in direct negotiations, leading to a ceasefire and hopes for a lasting resolution. However, this peace process collapsed in 2015 when violence resumed. And today, the PKK operates primarily in southeastern Turkey and northern Iraq, where it has established bases in mountainous regions, and these territories provide strategic advantages for guerrilla warfare and cross-border operations. Alright, next up we got Hezbollah, and Hezbollah is a Shiite militant group and political party based in Lebanon. Founded in 1982 during the Lebanese Civil War, Hezbollah emerged as a response to the Israeli invasion of Lebanon and the perceived marginalization of the Shiite community. The group was established with significant support from Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps, reflecting its strong ideological and logistical ties to the Iranian regime. The foundational goals of Hezbollah included the expulsion of Israeli forces from Lebanon, the establishment of an Islamic State in Lebanon, and resistance against Western influence in the region. Now the leadership has been marked by several key figures, most notably Hassan Nasrallah, whose leadership was pivotal in shaping Hezbollah's strategy and expanding its influence both within Lebanon and beyond. The 1980s and 1990s saw Hezbollah engage in numerous attacks against Israeli forces and their allies in Lebanon, as well as kidnappings and bombings targeting Western interests. The group gained notoriety for high-profile attacks, such as the 1983 bombings of the U.S. Embassy and Marine barracks in Beirut, which killed hundreds of American and French servicemen. These attacks were part of a broader strategy to drive Western forces out of Lebanon and were instrumental in establishing Hezbollah's reputation as a formidable militant organization. They also developed a sophisticated social services network, providing healthcare, education, and welfare services to the Shiite community in Lebanon, and this network helped to build support and legitimacy, particularly in the impoverished southern regions and Bekaa Valley. The eventual withdrawal of Israeli forces from southern Lebanon in 2000 was a major victory for Hezbollah, cementing its status as a resistance movement, which was largely attributed to the sustained guerrilla warfare campaign waged by them. Following this victory, they continued to build military capabilities, acquiring an arsenal of rockets and missiles with the assistance of Iran and Syria. In 2006, Hezbollah and Israel fought a month-long war known as the July War or the Second Lebanon War, which began after Hezbollah launched a cross-border raid, capturing 2 Israeli soldiers, and the ensuing war caused widespread destruction in Lebanon, particularly in the southern regions and parts of Beirut, and resulted in significant casualties on both sides. Despite the heavy toll, Hezbollah emerged from the conflict with an enhanced reputation for its resistance and ability to stand up against the Israeli military. Their activities and influence have led to widespread international concern and, of course, designation as a terrorist organization by by countries including the United States, Canada, and several European Union member states, and the group's financial networks, involvement in global criminal activities such as drug trafficking, and its military capabilities have drawn intense scrutiny and sanctions. They remain one of the most powerful and complex entities in the Middle East, and they are viewed both as a legitimate political and social force within Lebanon and as a formidable militant organization by its adversaries. Alright, next up we get the Black September Organization, and the Black September Organization, or BSO, was a Palestinian militant faction that emerged in the early 1970s, known for its high-profile acts of terrorism, most notably the Munich Olympic Massacre. The group was named after the Black September conflict of 1970, when the Jordanian army clashed with Palestinian factions, including the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or the PLO, resulting in thousands of Palestinian casualties and a significant loss of influence for the PLO in Jordan. Many members of Fatah, a dominant faction within the PLO, sought to avenge the deaths of their comrades and maintain struggle for Palestinian liberation, leading to the formation of BSO in 1971. One of the first major acts attributed to this organization was the assassination of Jordanian Prime Minister Wasfi al-Tal in Cairo in November 1971, which led to the group gaining international notoriety for its ruthless and highly publicized operations. The next most infamous attack was the hostage-taking and massacre of Israeli athletes at the 1972 Munich Olympic Games. On September 5th, 1972, 8 Black September members would infiltrate the Olympic Village and take 11 Israeli athletes and coaches hostage, and demanded the release of 234 Palestinian prisoners held in the Israeli jails. The crisis ended tragically when a botched rescue attempt by German authorities resulted in the deaths of all 11 hostages, 5 of the 8 terrorists, and a German police officer. The Munich massacre shocked the world and brought unprecedented attention to the Palestinian cause, although it also garnered widespread condemnation for its brutality. Following the Munich attack, Black September continued to carry out high-profile operations, including a hijacking of Sabena Flight 571 and the assassination of the American ambassador Cleo A. Noel Jr. and his deputy George C. Moore in 1973. The group's activities would bring increased scrutiny and crackdowns from international intelligence and security agencies, and as a result, by the late 1970s, Black September's operations began to wane, and the PLO, becoming increasingly diplomatic, led to the eventual disbandment of Black September as a distinct entity, with many of its members reintegrating into Fatah and other PLO factions. Alright, next up we have ANTIFA, and ANTIFA, short for anti-fascist, is a loosely affiliated network of activists and groups that oppose fascism, racism, and other forms of extreme right-wing ideology. The term and the movement trace their origins to 1930s Europe, where anti-fascist groups emerged to combat the rise of Nazi and fascist movements in Germany, Italy, and other countries. Now, the modern ANTIFA movement reemerged in the latter part of the 20th century, gaining significant traction within the United States and Europe in response to the rise of far-right political movements and events. In the United States, ANTIFA would gain considerable attention during the 2010s as a response to increasing visibility of white supremacist, neo-Nazi, and alt-right groups, and the movement's activities often included organizing counter-protests, monitoring and exposing far-right individuals and organizations, and sometimes engaging in direct action tactics, such as property damage. One of the most significant and widely publicized incidents involving ANTIFA occurred in August of 2017 during the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. And this rally, organized by various white nationalist and far-right groups, drew widespread condemnation after violent clashes erupted between attendees and counter-protesters, including ANTIFA members. The violence culminated in the tragic death of Heather Heyer, who was killed when a white supremacist drove his car into a crowd of counter-protesters. The movement has been highly controversial, attracting both support and criticism. Supporters argue that ANTIFA plays a crucial role in directly confronting and disrupting dangerous far-right movements. However, critics contend that ANTIFA's use of violent tactics undermines its moral authority and contributes to further societal polarization. Despite the controversy, ANTIFA remains an active and visible force, particularly in the United States and Europe, and the movement continues to mobilize in response to far-right events and figures, often playing a significant role in shaping public discourse around issues of fascism, racism, and extremism. Alright, next up we got the Proud Boys, and the Proud Boys is a far-right, male-only organization founded in 2016 by Gavin McInnes, co-founder of the media company Vice. The group describes itself as a pro-Western fraternal organization that promotes anti-political correctness and anti-white guilt agenda. The Proud Boys are known for their provocative rhetoric and willingness to engage in street violence, and they have been widely characterized as extremist, nationalist, and sometimes violent, drawing scrutiny from law enforcement and civil rights organizations. Their ideology is a mix of nationalism, libertarianism, and elements of the so-called alt-right, though they often reject that label. They have been involved in various protests and rallies across the United States, frequently clashing with left-wing groups such as ANTIFA. They have been involved in numerous violent incidents and street brawls, and even played a notable role in the events leading up to and during the January 6, 2021 attack on the U.S. Capitol. Several Proud Boy members were arrested and charged with crimes related to the insurrection, including conspiracy, assault, and property damage. There's also a case in which they were all found in the back of a van just chilling. But they were planning to infiltrate a counter-protest and got caught in that situation. Despite their setbacks, the Proud Boys continue to operate, though their activities have been more clandestine. Alright, next up we have Aum Shinrikyo, and Aum Shinrikyo was a Japanese doomsday cult founded by Shoko Asahara in 1984, infamous in its involvement of a series of violent and deadly incidents, most notably the 1995 Tokyo subway sarin gas attack. The group's ideology combined elements of Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, and apocalyptic beliefs, with Asahara proclaiming himself as a messiah figure destined to lead his followers to the end times. Now, we kind of talked about this group in the cult iceberg. The cult carried out several attacks before the Tokyo subway incident, including the 1994 sarin gas attack in Matsumoto, which killed 8 people and injured over 500, and the Tokyo subway gas attack in 1995, which killed 13 people, severely injured 50, and affected over 1,000. And we know Asahara, along with 6 other members who were arrested, were executed in 2018. Now, the legacy of Aum Shinrikyo is one of terror and tragedy, marking one of the few incidents in modern history where a religious cult successfully carried out large-scale chemical attacks on a civilian population. And the group's activities have spurred greater collaboration between intelligence and law enforcement agencies to monitor and counteract similar threats. Alright, next up we got the Maoist Communist Party of India, and the Maoist Communist Party of India, commonly known as the Naxalite movement, is a far-left radical communist group that seeks to overthrow the Indian government and establish a Marxist-Leninist Maoist state. The roots of this movement could be traced back to the late 1960s in the village of Naxalbari in West Bengal, where a peasant uprising led by local communist leaders marked the beginning of the Naxalite movement. The early leaders of the Naxalite movement included Charu Majumdar and Kanu Sanyal, who were instrumental in mobilizing the rural poor, particularly the landless peasants, against feudal landowning classes. The movement quickly spread to other parts of India, becoming synonymous with violent insurgency and armed struggle. The Indian government would respond with a series of counterinsurgency operations, leading to numerous clashes and the deaths of several key leaders. In 1972. In the ensuing decades, the movement splintered into various factions, with the most prominent being the Communist Party of India, formed in 2004 through the merger of the Maoist Communist Center of India and the People's War Group. The unification was a significant event as it consolidated the various Naxalite factions into a more cohesive and powerful organization. They quickly became the dominant force within the Naxalite movement, and the group's combatants, known as Naxalites or Maoists, would engage in hit-and-run attacks, ambushes, and bombings, targeting Indian security forces, infrastructure, and political figures. One of the deadliest incidents occurred in April 2010 when Naxalites ambushed a convoy of Central Reserve Police Force, killing 76 personnel. And other significant attacks include the 2013 ambush in Darba Valley, where 27 people, including senior leaders of the Indian National Congress, were killed. The Indian government responded to the Naxalite insurgency with a combination of military action and development initiatives aimed at addressing the underlying socio-economic issues that fueled the rebellion. Operation Green Hunt launched in 2009, which was a large-scale anti-Naxalite operation involving tens of thousands of paramilitary and police forces. However, despite these efforts, the insurgency has still proven itself resilient. Multiple leaders within the group have been killed. However, the Naxalite insurgency remains one of India's most pressing internal security challenges. And while the intensity of the conflict has fluctuated over the years, it continues to claim lives and disrupt development in affected regions. Alright, next up we have the Gunpowder Plot, and the Gunpowder Plot or the Gunpowder Conspiracy was a failed attempt to assassinate King James I of England and blow up the House of Lords during the state opening Parliament of November 5th, 1605. The plot was orchestrated by a group of English Catholics who sought to end the persecution of Catholics by the Protestant government and restore a Catholic monarch to the throne. The leader of the Gunpowder Plot was Robert Catesby, a Catholic who had previously been involved in other failed rebellions, and he gathered a group of conspirators including Thomas and Robert Wintour, Thomas Percy, John Wright, and Guy Fawkes. The plotters rented a cellar beneath the House of Lords where they stored 36 barrels of gunpowder, enough to destroy the entire building and kill everybody, and they planned to detonate the gunpowder during the state opening of Parliament, which would have killed the king, his family, and many key members of the Protestant aristocracy. However, the plot began to unravel in October 1605 when an anonymous letter was sent to William Parker warning him to avoid attending the state opening of Parliament, and the letter was revealed to authorities and an investigation was launched, and Guy Fawkes would be arrested on November 4th, 1605, and under torture he would reveal the names of his fellow conspirators, leading to their capture and the collapse of the plot. The discovery of the Gunpowder Plot had significant repercussions, and it led to a tightening of anti-Catholic laws and increased suspicion and persecution of Catholics in England. And the event was commemorated with an annual national holiday, Guy Fawkes Night, observed on November 5th. Alright, next up we have the Lord's Resistance Army, and the Lord's Resistance Army, or the LRA, is a militant group that originated in northern Uganda in the late 1980s. It was founded and led by Joseph Kony, who claimed to be a spiritual medium and a spokesperson for God. They're known for their brutal tactics, including the abduction of children to serve as soldiers and sex slaves, and they're also known for the widespread killings and mutilations. The group's professed aim has been to overthrow the Ugandan government and establish a theocratic state based on Kony's interpretation of the Ten Commandments. Under Kony's leadership, the LRA waged a brutal campaign against the Ugandan government and civilians, particularly targeting the Akoli population from which it originated, and became infamous for its use of child soldiers, abducting thousands of children from their homes and forcing them into combat or servitude. Boys were often forced to kill their own families as a means of severing ties to their communities and ensuring loyalty to the LRA, and girls were frequently subjected to sexual violence and forced marriages to LRA fighters. In 2008, the United States would eventually designate the LRA as a terrorist organization and begin providing logistical and intelligence support to regional military forces for fighting the group. And in 2010, President Barack Obama signed the LRA Disarmament and Northern Uganda Recovery Act, which authorized increased U.S. involvement in efforts to apprehend Kony and dismantle the LRA. By today, the LRA is considered a diminished but persistent threat, and the group's strength and operational capacity have significantly declined due to sustained military pressure. However, their leaders, including Joseph Kony, have not been found. Alright, next up we got the Azov Battalion, and the Azov Battalion, formed in May of 2014, is a Ukrainian far-right nationalist militia that gained prominence during the conflict in eastern Ukraine. Initially composed of ultra-nationalists and far-right activists, it became an effective fighting force against Russian-backed separatists in Donetsk and Luhansk. Founded by Andriy Beletsky and funded by private donations, it played a key role in recapturing Mariupol and was incorporated into the National Guard of Ukraine in November of 2014. Despite its military success, the battalion has faced controversy due to its far-right ideological roots, neo-Nazi symbols, and alleged human rights abuses. It has also engaged in political and social initiatives with leaders involved in nationalist movements. The battalion remains a significant and contentious component of Ukraine's defense forces, reflecting the complexities of the ongoing conflict and even raising concerns about the influence of extremism within the military. Internationally, the Azov Battalion is viewed with weariness, complicating support for Ukraine, especially during its invasion from Russia, while within the country it garners mixed views, seen as both a symbol of resistance and a potential threat due to its extremist affiliations. Alright, next up we got Boogaloo Boys, and the Boogaloo Boys, also known as the Boogaloo Movement, is a loosely organized far-right anti-government extremist group that emerged in the United States in the late 2010s. Advocating for a second American Civil War, often referred to as the Boogaloo, the movement opposes government authority, which it views as tyrannical. The term Boogaloo originated as a meme, but was adopted by far-right extremists, and members, often seen in Hawaiian shirts paired with military gear, gained attention during the 2020 George Floyd protests, where their presence sometimes escalated tensions. The movement's decentralized structure with no clear hierarchy complicates law enforcement efforts to infiltrate and disrupt it, and they communicate and recruit online, spreading their anti-government ideology rapidly. High-profile incidents such as the murder of a federal officer in Oakland and a plot to kidnap Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer have underscored the movement's violent potential, and law enforcement agencies consider the movement a serious domestic terrorism threat due to its advocacy for insurrection, access to firearms, and involvement in violent acts. Public perception is largely negative, viewing the Boogaloo Boys as a destabilizing force exploiting social unrest. However, some libertarian circles see them as defenders of individual liberties. Alright, moving on to tier 2. I feel like I think I'm like spending too much time talking about a lot of these specific ones. I'm gonna try to keep it like more broader going forward. But yeah, tier 2. Alright, next up we got M19 Co. And M19 Co, or M19, was a Colombian guerrilla group formed in 1974 in response to the disputed 1970 presidential election. Founded by urban intellectuals, former military officers, and students, M19 aimed to address electoral fraud and political repression through bold symbolic actions. Notable operations included the theft of Bolivar's sword, kidnapping of diplomats at the Dominican Republic's embassy in 1980, the seizure of assault rifles from a military depot in 1981, and the violent 1985 Palace of Justice siege, which resulted in over 100 deaths. After the siege, M19 faced decline due to military repression and internal divisions, and under Carlos Pizarro's leadership, the group shifted towards political negotiation, culminating in the 1990 peace agreement. M19 disarmed and transformed into the political party AD-M19, contributing significantly to the 1991 constitution. Despite Pizarro's assassination in 1990, former members continued to influence Colombian politics, achieving notable political careers. Alright, next up we got the Ustaše, and the Ustaše was a Croatian fascist ultranationalist and terrorist organization founded in 1929 by Ante Pavelic. They aimed for an independent Croatian state and were characterized by extreme nationalism, xenophobia, and violence. Influenced by fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, the Ustaše conducted terrorist attacks in the 1930s, including the 1934 assassination of King Alexander I of Yugoslavia, and with the Axis invasion of Yugoslavia in 1941, the Ustaše established the independent state of Croatia under Nazi and Italian control, with Ante as the leader. Their regime pursued brutal and ethnic cleansing, targeting Serbs, Jews, Roma, and political opponents, establishing notorious concentration camps like Jasenovac. Their actions, including forced conversions of Orthodox Serbs to Catholicism, exacerbated ethnic tensions. However, they faced resistance that came from groups like Tito's partisans, who ultimately liberated Yugoslavia by 1945. Post-war, many Ustaše members, including Ante, fled abroad, and he eventually settled in Argentina. Alright, next up we got the Abu Nidal Organization. In the Abu Nidal Organization, or ANO, founded by Sabri al-Banna, and was created in 1974 after a split from Fatah, the Palestinian militant group notorious for its extreme violence and radical Palestinian nationalism. Sabri al-Banna was born in 1937 in Palestine and was influenced by his family's displacement during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. After joining and being expelled from the Fatah, he formed the ANO, advocating for Israel's destruction and opposing compromise. They gained infamy for their brutal attacks, including hijackings, bombings, and assassinations. And notable attacks include the 1985 Rome and Vienna airport assaults, killing 19 and injuring 140, and the assassinations of Palestinian moderates like Saeed Hamami and PLO officials. The group received support from Iraq, Syria, and Libya, shifting bases as political alliance changed, primarily operating from Lebanon and later Iraq. By the 1990s, the ANO's influence waned due to its extreme ideology and internal purges by Abu Nidal, and Abu Nidal's mysterious death in 2002 marked the end of the group. They're estimated to have killed hundreds in over 20 countries, and its decline is attributed to the loss of state sponsorship and changing Middle Eastern dynamics. Today, the ANO is defunct, serving as a historical example of the perils of radical extremism. Alright, next up we have Combat 18, and Combat 18 or C-18 is a neo-Nazi white supremacist organization founded in the UK in 1992 as the armed wing of the British National Party, or BNP. The group advocates for racial purity, anti-Semitism, and violence, and C-18 quickly became notorious for violent acts, including the 1993 murder of anti-fascist activist Chris Castle. Internal conflicts weakened the group, but it continued to commit violence and hate crimes through the late 1990s and early 2000s. They established international connections with cells in Germany, Sweden, Canada, and the United States, contributing to a transnational network of far-right extremism. The group has been banned or designated as a terrorist organization in several countries, leading to arrests and prosecutions of its members. However, despite its declining visibility, C-18 remains a concern for law enforcement due to its potential for resurgence, inspired by the rise of new far-right movements and online extremist content. Alright, next up we have the Symbionese Liberation Army, or SLA, and the SLA was a radical left-wing organization active in the early 1970s in the United States, known for its commitment to revolutionary ideologies and violent methods. Founded in 1973 by Donald DeFries, the SLA's ideology combined Marxism and black nationalism. Its members, a small group of radicalized individuals, first gained national attention with the assassination of Oakland school superintendent Marcus Foster in 1973. Their most notorious act was in 1974 kidnapping of Patty Hearst, and during her captivity, Hearst was allegedly brainwashed and later participated in SLA activities, including the armed robbery of the Hibernia Bank in San Francisco. In May of 1974, a dramatic shootout and fire at a Los Angeles safe house resulted in the deaths of 6 SLA members, including DeFries, and the event crippled the organization, but its remaining members, including Hearst, continued criminal activities until their capture in 1975. Hearst's trial drew significant media attention, and she was eventually convicted of bank robbery. Her sentence, however, was later commuted by Jimmy Carter, and she was pardoned by Bill Clinton in 2001. The SLA's brief but violent existence remains a subject of historical study and public fascination, particularly regarding the psychological aspects of Hearst's kidnapping and indoctrination, and the group serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of radical ideologies. Next up we have the Black Liberation Army. And the Black Liberation Army, or BLA, was an underground black nationalist militant group in the US from the early 1970s to the early 1980s. It emerged from the fragmented Black Panther Party and other black liberation movements being formed in response to systemic oppression and racial injustice. The BLA aimed for black liberation through armed struggle against the US government, and the group carried out armed robberies, prison breaks, and attacks on law enforcement, viewing police officers as enforcers of a racist state. Infamous actions include the 1971 murder of NYC police officers in the 1973 shootout on the New Jersey Turnpike, leading to one of the leaders, Assata Shakur's imprisonment, who eventually escaped to Cuba. Throughout the 1970s, the BLA conducted bank robberies to fund their operations, and FBI's COINTELPRO even targeted the BLA, leading to its decline by the mid-1980s. They would eventually disband due to arrests, internal conflicts, and the radical left's overall decline. Former members went underground, were incarcerated, or shifted to other activism, and despite its brief activity, they left a significant impact on American radicalism and discussions on racial injustice and state violence. Alright, next up we have Red Hand Commando. Red Hand Commando, or RHC, is a loyalist paramilitary group in Northern Ireland formed in 1972 during the Troubles. Founded by John McKeague, the RHC aimed to maintain Northern Ireland's union with the UK and counter the Irish Republican Army and other nationalist groups. They engaged in assassinations, bombings, and shootings, targeting IRA members and the Catholic community. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, they participated in numerous violent incidents and conducted sectarian attacks to intimidate the Catholic population and carried out high-profile killings of nationalist figures. Despite operating primarily in Northern Ireland, they occasionally targeted British security forces and conducted operations in the Republic of Ireland. The peace process began in the 1990s, leading to a ceasefire in 1994 and the signing of the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. They engaged in decommissioning weapons, although some criminal activities persisted, including drug trafficking and extortion. The group's legacy is a reminder of the Troubles, sectarian conflict, and the importance of continued efforts towards peace and reconciliation. Alright, next up we got the National Socialist Underground, and the National Socialist Underground, or NSU, was a far-right neo-Nazi terrorist group in Germany, active from the late 1990s until 2011. Emerging from the far-right scene, they went underground in 1998, and between 2000 and 2007, they executed the Bosporus murders, targeting Turkish and Greek business owners and carried out bombings in Turkish neighborhoods. Their crimes were funded by bank robberies, allowing them to evade capture for over a decade. They were discovered in 2011 after 2 members committed a murder suicide following a botched bank robbery, and one other member set fire to their apartment trying to destroy evidence, and she subsequently turned herself in. Their exposure caused a major scandal, revealing failures in German intelligence and law enforcement, including allegations of institutional racism. The trial of the woman who turned herself in began in 2013, concluding in 2018 with life imprisonment, and their activities led to significant reforms in Germany's approach to right-wing extremism, improving coordination and monitoring. Alright, next up we got the Red Army faction, and the Red Army faction, or the RAF, was a far-left militant organization in West Germany active from the late 1960s until the early 1990s. Founded in 1970, the RAF aimed to overthrow the perceived fascist state and fight imperialism through violent means, and they were inspired by Marxist-Leninist ideology. The group's most notorious period, the German Autumn of 1977, involved high-profile kidnappings and murders, including the kidnapping and killing of industrialist Hans Martens and the hijacking of the Lufthansa Flight 181. The hijacking ended with a successful German Special Forces operation, but the RAF's imprisoned leaders were found dead in their cells, officially ruled as sides. The RAF would continue attacks through a second generation of militants, but also faced increasing law enforcement pressure. Notable attacks included the assassination of banker Hans Tietmeyer in 1989 and the 1981 bombings of the U.S. Air Force Base in Ramstein. By the late 1980s, their activities dwindled, and in 1992, they declared a ceasefire and formally disbanded in 1998. Alright, next up we got the Revolutionary Cells, or RZ, and they were a left-wing militant organization active in West Germany from the early 1970s to the early 1990s, emerging from the political radicalism of the 1960s and early 1970s. They aimed to overthrow capitalist and imperialist systems through direct action and sabotage, and unlike other militant groups like the Red Army faction, the RZ operated in small autonomous cells, which helped them evade law enforcement. Notable attacks included the 1974 bombing of the German Federal Court of Justice and the 1976 Air France hijacking in collaboration with the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Throughout the 1980s, they continued targeting U.S. military installations, German corporations, and political figures. However, their activities waned with the political changes of the late 1980s and early 1990s, such as the fall of the Berlin Wall and German reunification. In 1992, the RZ disbanded, acknowledging the changed political context. Alright, next up we have the Japanese Red Army, and the Japanese Red Army, or JRA, was a far-left militant organization founded in 1971 by Fusako Shigenobu with the goal of overthrowing the Japanese government and inciting global revolution. Emerging from the radical student movements of the 1960s, the JRA formed an alliance with the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, gaining training and resources. The JRA's first major operation was the 1972 attack on Lod Airport in Tel Aviv, killing 26 people and injuring around 80. The group continued with high-profile incidents such as the 1973 hijacking of Japan Airlines Flight 404 and the 1974 storming of the French embassy in The Hague. The JRA operated globally, targeting Western and Japanese interests and participating in Palestinian militant activities. However, their activities would decline in the late 1980s and early 1990s due to increased counterterrorism efforts, and Fusako would be arrested in 2000 and sentenced to 20 years in prison. The JRA would officially disband in 2001, recognizing its own diminished capabilities. Alright, next up we have the Base, and the Base is a far-right, white supremacist and neo-Nazi hate group that emerged in the United States in 2018. Founded by Ronaldo Nazzaro, a former U.S. Department of Homeland Security employee, the group advocates for a violent overthrow of the government and creation of a white ethno-state. Its name, translating to Al-Qaeda in Arabic, signals intent to operate as a militant organization with an ideology rooted in white nationalism. The Base recruits members through encrypted online platforms, promoting paramilitary training, survivalism, and racial purity, and they organize training camps across the rural U.S. locations, preparing members for violent confrontations. Members have been involved in various criminal activities, including conspiracy to commit murder and illegal possession of firearms, and notable arrests in January 2020 disrupted plots to murder anti-fascist activists and incite violence at a gun rights rally in Virginia. The group's influence extends beyond the United States, with cells in Canada, Europe, and Australia, and in Canada, individuals linked to the Base were implicated in hate crimes and violent plots, including Patrick Matthews, who was a former Canadian Army reservist arrested in the U.S. for planning attacks. Operating with secrecy, the Base uses encrypted communications and propaganda videos to recruit and inspire violence. and law enforcement agencies view the base as a significant terrorism threat due to its paramilitary focus and explicit calls for violence. Alright, next up we have the Atomwaffen Division. Atomwaffen Division, or AWD, is a neo-Nazi terrorist organization that emerged in the US in 2013. Founded by Brandon Russell, a former Florida National Guardsman, the group promotes a violent white supremacist ideology rooted in anti-Semitism and accelerationism, or the belief that societal collapse should be hastened through extreme violence to establish a new order based on racial purity. They originated on the fascist forum Iron March, where members shared neo-Nazi propaganda and extremist literature. Members have been linked to violent crimes, including murders and bomb plots, and notable incidents include the 2017 murders committed by Devin Arthurs in Tampa, and the 2018 murder of Blaze Bernstein by Samuel Woodward in California. They operate as a decentralized network of cells across the US and have international links, and members undergo paramilitary training in rural areas, preparing for violent confrontations. They use propaganda to recruit and radicalize disaffected young men, glorifying violence and promoting white supremacist ideologies, and law enforcement agencies, including the FBI, consider the group a significant domestic terrorism threat due to its commitment to accelerationism and ability to inspire lone wolf attacks. Efforts to dismantle the group have led to numerous arrests, but its decentralized structure and ideological appeal pose ongoing challenges today. Alright, next up we have the Army of God, and the Army of God, or AOG, is a far-right Christian extremist group in the United States advocating for violence against abortion providers. Emerging in the early 1980s, they operate on a decentralized model with individuals in small cells acting independently under a shared anti-abortion ideology. Their origins are tied to the radical fringe of the anti-abortion movement following the Supreme Court's 1973 Roe v. Wade decision, and one of its earliest acts was a 1982 kidnapping of Dr. Hector Zavalos and his wife. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, they claim responsibility for numerous bombings and arson attacks on abortion clinics. Their ideology is based on fundamentalist Christian view that equates abortion with murder, justifying violence as divine retribution. The decentralized structure makes it difficult for law enforcement to track and infiltrate them, and despite the arrest of key members, the group remains active, with incidents of violence across abortion providers continuing, though they're less frequent in the past decades. Alright, next up we got the Weather Underground, and the Weather Underground, or WO, also known as the Weathermen, was a radical left-wing militant organization active in the United States during the late 1960s and 1970s. The Weather Underground sought to overthrow the US government and end American imperialism through revolutionary violence. Their first major action was called the Days of Rage in October of 1969, which were violent demonstrations in Chicago. They then shifted to bombings, targeting government buildings, military installations, and corporations associated with the Vietnam War. Significant bombings included the New York City Police Department headquarters in 1970, the U.S. Capitol, the Pentagon, and the Department of State. They took precautions to avoid casualties, issuing warnings before bombings, though some attacks resulted in injuries and significant property damage. The Greenwich Village townhouse explosion in March 1970, where members accidentally detonated a bomb, killed 3 members and forced many leaders into hiding. And despite maintaining a fugitive lifestyle, the group's activities waned by the late 1970s as the Vietnam War ended and the political climate shifted, and the group was formally disbanded in 1977. Alright, next up we have Janjaweed, and Janjaweed is a militia group that is operated in Sudan's Darfur region since the early 2000s, known for its brutal tactics including genocide, ethnic cleansing, rape, and displacement. Composed mainly of Arab nomadic tribesmen, the Janjaweed emerged from ethnic and economic tensions between nomadic Arab tribes and other African farming communities, which was exacerbated by resource competition and political marginalization. In 2003, non-Arab rebel groups SLA and JEM attacked the Sudanese government, accusing it of neglecting Darfur's non-Arab population, and in response, President Omar al-Bashir armed the Janjaweed to suppress the rebellion, using them as a proxy force targeting civilians perceived to support the rebels. The Janjaweed's operations led to millions being displaced and created a severe humanitarian crisis. One of the most notorious Janjaweed attacks occurred in Tawila in 2004, where over 100 were killed, more than 100 women and girls were raped, and homes were burned. The international community responded with condemnation, humanitarian aid, and calls for justice. The UN described Darfur as the world's worst humanitarian crisis in 2004, and the ICC issued arrest warrants for al-Bashir in 2010 for genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The AU and UN deployed peacekeeping forces, but ended up facing numerous challenges. The conflict's intensity had diminished, but the Janjaweed's legacy continues. Many of the fighters have been absorbed into paramilitary forces like the RSF, or Rapid Support Forces, but overall the group's activity has dissipated. Alright, next up we have the Donetsk People's Republic, and the Donetsk People's Republic, or DPR, is a self-proclaimed separatist state in eastern Ukraine, emerging from the 2014 conflict following the Euromaidan protests and Russia's annexation of Crimea. Declared in 2014 by pro-Russia's activists, the DPR, along with the Luhansk People's Republic, sought independence from Ukraine, citing alienation by the new pro-Western government in Kiev. The DPR's origins lie in the political turmoil of late 2013 and early 2014, marked by the protests demanding closer EU ties and the ousting of President Viktor Yanukovych. Pro-Russian sentiment surged in Ukraine, leading to the seizure of government buildings and declarations of independence in Donetsk and Luhansk, and the DPR's leadership included local separatists and Russian nationals. A controversial referendum in May 2014 claimed overwhelming support for independence, though it was widely disputed and unrecognized internationally, and the conflict would escalate into full-scale war with significant support from Russia, including arms and volunteers. Key battles included Sloviansk, Mariupol, Donetsk Airport, and the Baltsev, and the downing of Malaysia Airlines flight MH17 in July 2014, killing 300 people, was attributed to a missile launch from DPR-controlled territory, further intensifying international condemnation. The Minsk agreements in 2014 and 2015 aimed to de-escalate the conflict, but saw frequent violations, and the DPR still remains reliant on Russian support, with no doubt members of the group joining against the war against Ukraine, and the conflict has caused significant humanitarian crises, with thousands dead and widespread displacement. Alright, next up we have the Luhansk People's Republic, or LPR, and the LPR is a self-proclaimed separatist state in eastern Ukraine, emerging in April 2014 amidst the political upheaval following the protests and Russia's annexation of Crimea. Now, this is essentially just another branch of one of the separatist states during this conflict. Yeah, it's pretty much, I don't want to say they're one and the same with the DPR, but it's the same idea, I guess. Alright, next up we have Narodnaya Volya, or the People's Will, and this group was a revolutionary political organization in the late 19th century Russia, emerging in 1879 from a split in the populist group Land and Liberty. This group advocated for violent action, including terrorism, to overthrow the Tsarist regime and implement political and social reforms. They arose from dissatisfaction with Tsar Alexander II's repressive policies, like the 1861 emancipation of the serfs. The group believed that targeted assassinations would destabilize the regime and incite broader revolution, and their most notable achievement was the assassination of Tsar Alexander II on March 13, 1881, using a series of bombs in St. Petersburg. However, this act led to severe government crackdowns under Alexander III, resulting in the arrest, execution, or exile of many members, eventually leading to the group's eventual dismantling. Alright, next up we have the Muslim Brotherhood, and this is an Islamist organization founded in Egypt in 1928 by Hassan al-Banna. It began as a movement to promote Islamic principles and values through education and charity, quickly growing in size and influence across the Arab world. Initially focused on social and religious activities, they increasingly engaged in political activism, opposing British colonial rule and advocating for Egyptian independence. During the 1940s, the Brotherhood supported the Palestinian cause and opposed Israel's establishment, and developed a paramilitary wing called the Secret Apparatus, which engaged in violent activities, leading to government crackdowns. In 1949, Hassan al-Banna would be assassinated, and the Brotherhood would initially begin to support Gamal Abdel Nasser after the 1952 revolution, but continued to face severe repression following a failed assassination attempt on Nasser in 1954. Despite repression, the Brotherhood would survive and reorganize, participating in social and political activities. In the 1980s and 1990s, they expanded their activities, participating in professional syndicates, student unions, and parliamentary elections. Despite periodic crackdowns, it maintained significant presence in Egyptian society, advocating for political reform and Islamic governance. Their fortunes would change during the Arab Spring of 2011, leading to the ousting of President Hosni Mubarak, and the Brotherhood established the Freedom and Justice Party and won significant representation in elections. In 2012, Mohamed Morsi, a senior Brotherhood member, would be elected the president of Egypt. However, his presidency faced significant challenges, leading to his ousting by the military in 2013, which was followed by a severe crackdown on the Brotherhood. Although the activity diminished in Egypt, the Brotherhood retains influence through its international branches, and they still participate in politics, seen as legitimate in some regions and seen as a terrorist organization in others. Alright, moving on to tier 3. Alright, next up we have the Polisario Front, and they are a nationalist movement dedicated to achieving independence for Western Sahara. Founded in 1973 by El Oyali Mustafa Sayed, the group emerged in response to Spanish colonization and has since struggled for sovereignty against Morocco, which claims the territory. They formed as Spanish colonial rule declined, gaining support among the Sahrawi population, and in 1975, Spain withdrew from the Western Sahara, dividing it between Morocco and Mauritania, which was a move opposed by the Polisario. The group declared the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic in 1976 and waged a guerrilla war. By 1979, Mauritania withdrew, leaving Morocco as the primary adversary. Supported by Algeria, the Polisario established refugee camps in Algeria and continued its conflict with Morocco, which built defensive walls to control the territory. In 1991, a UN-brokered ceasefire led to the establishment of the United Nations mission for the referendum in Western Sahara, but the referendum has yet to occur due to disputes. Since the ceasefire, Polisario has focused on diplomatic efforts, and the SADR is recognized by over 40 countries and is a member of the African Union, though major powers like the US and France support Morocco, and tensions occasionally flare to this day. Alright, next up we have the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or FARC, and this is a Marxist-Leninist guerrilla group founded in 1964. Initially formed to address rural inequality and land rights, it evolved into one of Latin America's largest rebel groups, financing its operations through drug trafficking, kidnapping, and extortion. FARC's origins trace back to peasant self-defense groups like the Colombian Communist Party, and the FARC aimed to overthrow the Colombian government. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, it expanded control over rural areas, establishing semi-autonomous zones and increasing involvement in the cocaine trade. They employed guerrilla tactics, targeting military and police with ambushes, bombings, and kidnappings, including the high-profile kidnapping of Ingrid Betancourt. At its peak in the 1990s, the FARC had around 20,000 combatants and controlled large territories. Despite several failed peace talks, the group maintained its operations until military offensives in the early 2000s weakened it significantly. In 2012, peace talks initiated by President Juan Manuel Santos led to a historic peace agreement in 2016, and the FARC would disband as a militant group and transformed into a political party, the Common Alternative Revolutionary Force, in 2017. Alright, next up we have the Euskadi Ta Askatasuna, or the ETA, and this was a Basque separatist militant organization founded in 1959. Its goal was to establish an independent Basque state across regions in Spain and France, and initially formed from the Basque Nationalist Party's youth wing, and they were deeply influenced by Francisco Franco's repressive dictatorship, which suppressed Basque culture and political aspirations. They started as a cultural and political organization, but soon shifted to armed struggle, inspired by global revolutionary movements. And in 1968, they committed their first major violent act, killing a Spanish police officer. This marked the beginning of a long campaign of bombings, assassinations, and kidnappings, and one of the most significant attacks was the 1973 assassination of Spanish Prime Minister Luis Carrero Blanco, which drew international attention. They operated through very small autonomous cells coordinated by a central leadership, targeting both military officials and civilians to instill fear and pressure against the Spanish government. And despite ongoing violence, attempts at negotiation were made, but ceasefires often collapsed. The Spanish and French governments would respond with military and police actions, and anti-terrorism efforts led to the arrests of many ETA members, and the group's support base eroded over time due to increased repression and a decline in public sympathy for their violent tactics. In 2011, the ETA would announce cessation of armed activities and begin disarmament in 2017, and by May of 2018, ETA formally dissolved. Alright, next up we have Riyad-us Saliheen, also known as the Martyrs Brigade, and this is a Chechen Islamist militant group founded in the early 2000s by Shamil Basayev, emerging from the broader Chechen resistance against Russian rule. The group is infamous for its brutal tactics, including suicide bombings and hostage-taking. Their most notorious attacks include the 2002 Dubrovka theater hostage crisis in Moscow, where around 130 hostages and all militants died during the rescue operation, and the 2004 Beslan school siege, resulting in 333 hostage deaths, including 186 children. Following the death of Shamil Basayev in 2006 in a Russian Special Forces operation, the group's operational capabilities declined. Leadership passed to Doku Umarov, who declared the Caucasus Emirate in 2007. However, Russian counterterrorism efforts and the rise of ISIS further weakened the group. Today, the group is a diminished threat with significantly reduced operational capacity, and although occasional attacks by Chechen militants persist, the group no longer poses the same level of danger as in the early 2000s. Alright, next up we have the African National Congress. And the African National Congress, or the ANC, is a political party in South Africa founded in 1912 to advocate for the rights of black South Africans under colonial and apartheid rule. The ANC's early strategies were moderate, focusing on petitions and delegations to seek redress from the British government. However, the establishment of apartheid in 1948 prompted the ANC to adopt a more radical approach. In the 1950s, the ANC launched the Defiance Campaign, led by figures such as Nelson Mandela, advocating for nonviolent protests against apartheid laws. The Freedom Charter was adopted in 1955, outlining a vision for non-racial democratic South Africa, and following the Sharpeville massacre in 1960, the ANC formed its military wing and began an armed struggle against the apartheid regime. The South African government responded with severe repression, leading to the imprisonment of ANC leaders, including Mandela, and the ANC would continue to operate from exile, receiving support from neighboring countries and socialist nations. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, they continued their armed struggle and diplomatic efforts, and the Soweto uprising in 1976 and international sanctions increased pressure on the apartheid regime. President F.W. de Klerk unbanned the ANC and released Nelson Mandela, and negotiations between the ANC and the government led to the end of apartheid and the establishment of a democratic South Africa. The ANC won the first multiracial elections in 1994, with Mandela becoming the first black president. Alright, next up we got the Jewish Underground, and the Jewish Underground, also known as the Koch Movement, was a radical right-wing Jewish terrorist organization active in Israel during the late 1970s and early 1980s. Formed by Israeli settlers and activists frustrated with the government's policies towards Palestinians, the group's goal was to establish a greater Israel through violent means, targeting Palestinian civilians and political leaders. The group's violent activities began with the bombing of the Islamic College in Hebron in 1980, killing 2 students and injuring many others, and they also carried out bombings of Palestinian mayors' cars in the West Bank, severely injuring 2 mayors. In 1984, Israeli security services arrested several key members of the Jewish Underground, uncovering their violent plans. The subsequent trial revealed the group's extremist ideology, leading to lengthy prison sentences for many members. However, several sentences were later commuted or reduced due to political pressure and public sympathy. Despite the crackdown, the group's ideological legacy persisted, influencing subsequent generations of extremist settlers. Alright, next up we have the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, or the LTTE, or the Tamil Tigers, and they were a militant organization in Sri Lanka from the late 1970s until 2009, and they aimed to create an independent Tamil state in northern and eastern Sri Lanka, rooted in ethnic tensions between Sinhalese majority and Tamil minority. Their origins date back to the post-colonial period, when policies by Sinhalese-dominated governments marginalized Tamils, leading to discrimination in education, employment, and politics. Founded in 1976, their first major attack in 1983 sparked anti-Tamil riots and full-scale civil war. Throughout the 80s and 90s, they conducted effective guerrilla warfare, including high-profile assassinations like those of Indian Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi in 1991 and Sri Lankan President in 1993. They established a de facto state in controlled areas with their own administration, police, courts, and military capabilities, including the Sea Tigers and Air Tigers. Peace efforts such as the 2002 ceasefire brokered in by Norway failed as both sides violated agreements, and the final phase of the conflict began in 2006 with the Sri Lankan government launching a military offensive. By May of 2009, government forces encircled the remaining Tamil Tiger fighters, leading to the death of their leader and the defeat of the Tigers. The civil war resulted in a significant loss of life, which estimates 70 to 100,000 people were killed. And the final stages were marked by allegations of severe human rights abuses and war crimes by both sides. Alright, next up we have Lehigh, and Lehigh, also known as the Stern Gang, was a Zionist paramilitary organization founded in 1940 in Palestine. Lehigh's primary objective was to forcibly evict the British from Palestine and establish a Jewish state, and unlike other Zionist groups, they were willing to collaborate with any force, including Axis powers during World War II. They adopted extreme measures, which included targeted assassinations and bombings. One of their earliest actions was the assassination of Lord Moyen, the British Minister of the State for Middle East, in 1944, and they were also responsible for the assassination of Count Folke Bernadotte, who was a UN mediator, in 1948. Their tactics included bombings such as the 1946 bombing of the British administrative offices, which killed 91 people, and they operated with small, tightly knit cells. Despite significant opposition from British authorities and other Jewish groups, Lehigh continued its activities until the end of the British Mandate in 1948. With the establishment of Israel, Lehigh members were absorbed into the Israel Defense Forces, or IDF. Notably, the former Lehigh leader, Yitzhak Shamir, became the Prime Minister of Israel, being viewed by some as heroic and by others as controversial due to their violent methods and willingness to collaborate with Axis powers. All right, next up we have the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee, and this was a radical anti-racist organization founded in 1978 by former members of the Weather Underground. Named after the abolitionist John Brown, they aimed to combat white supremacy, specifically targeting the Ku Klux Klan and other racist groups, and their ideology was rooted in Marxism, Leninism, and anti-imperialism. They engaged in surveillance and intelligence gathering on Klan communities, organized protests, and conducted direct confrontations with Klan members. Despite their militant stance, they faced significant challenges, including surveillance and undermining efforts by law enforcement, internal divisions, and ideological differences. By the late 1980s, their influence waned due to changing political landscapes and a decline in white supremacist activities and shifting priorities of leftist movements. All right, next up we have the Houthi movement, and the Houthi movement, also known as Ansar Allah, is a Shia Islamist political and armed group from the Zaidi sect in northern Yemen. Founded by Hussein Badruddin al-Houthi in the 1990s, the movement sought to address the marginalization of the Zaidi community, initially focused on Zaidi revivalism in opposition to foreign interference. The group would turn to armed struggle following Hussein al-Houthi's death in 2004, with his brother Abdul Malik al-Houthi taking over leadership. From 2004 to 2010, they engaged in multiple uprisings against the Yemeni government, leading to significant casualties and displacement. During the Arab Spring of 2011, the group's influence grew, culminating in the capture of Yemen's capital, Sana'a, in 2014. This led to President Hadi fleeing to Saudi Arabia and the start of Saudi-led military intervention in 2015. The conflict has resulted in a severe humanitarian crisis with widespread famine, displacement, and destruction of infrastructure, and the Houthis have demonstrated significant military capabilities and have even received support from Iran. Despite attempts at peace negotiations, the conflict continues, and the Houthis maintain control over significant territories in Yemen. All right, next up we have the Shining Path, and the Shining Path is a Maoist guerrilla organization in Peru founded in the late 1960s by Abimael Guzman, who was a philosophy professor. The group originated from a faction within the Peruvian Communist Party, advocating for a peasant-led revolution to establish a communist state. They began their armed insurgency on May 17, 1980, rejecting electoral processes and initiating violent conflict to disrupt the political system and mobilize rural peasantry. The group employed guerrilla tactics including bombings and assassinations, expanding from rural areas to urban centers like Lima. The conflict led to significant civilian casualties and a humanitarian crisis, and the government's counterinsurgency campaign, marked by human rights abuses, further alienated the rural population. One of the group's most notorious acts was the Lucanomarca massacre in 1983, where 69 villagers were killed. Guzman's capture in 1992 weakened the Shining Path, leading to its splintering. Some factions continued the armed struggle, while others turned to criminal activities like drug trafficking, and the government's intensified efforts in the 1990s dismantled much of the group's infrastructure. In recent years, remnants of the Shining Path have emerged in several areas aligning with drug traffickers, and despite reduced capabilities, they continue to pose security challenges to this day. All right, next up we have Irgun, and Irgun, or Etzel, was a Zionist paramilitary organization in Mandatory Palestine from 1931 to 1948. Founded by dissidents from the Haganah, Irgun sought a more aggressive approach to securing a Jewish homeland. Rooted in revisionist Zionism led by Zev Jabotinsky, the ideology emphasized establishing a Jewish state on both sides of the Jordan River and rejected compromises on Jewish territorial claims. The group's early years were marked by violence, including bombings and assassinations, targeting British authorities and Arab opponents. During the Arab Revolt in 1936 to 1939, the group intensified attacks on Arab targets to protect Jewish communities, and the group split in 1937, leading to the formation of Lehigh, which pursued a more militant approach. During World War II, Irgun temporarily collaborated with the British against the Axis powers, but resumed anti-British activities after the war. Notably, the 1946 bombing of the King David Hotel in Jerusalem killed 91 people and underscored Irgun's determination to expel the British. With the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, they played a significant role, including the controversial Deir Yassin attack. Following Israel's establishment, they integrated into the Israeli Defense Forces, or IDF, and the group was disbanded in 1948. Alright, next up we have the Ethniki Organosis Kyprion Agonistan, or the EOKA, which was a Greek Cypriot nationalist guerrilla group that fought the British colonial rule in Cyprus from 1955 to 1959, aiming for a union with Greece. The EOKA launched its campaign with coordinated bomb attacks on April 1955, targeting British installations. The British responded with harsh crackdown, deploying additional troops and declaring state of emergency. They employed guerrilla warfare, sabotage, and targeted assassinations, also attacking Greek collaborators. The conflict would eventually end in 1959 with the Zurich and London agreements negotiated by the British, Greeks, and Turks, and establishing the Republic of Cyprus as an independent state with a power-sharing arrangement between Greek and Turkish Cypriots. Next up we have the Jewish Defense League, or JDL, and this is the far-right Jewish nationalist organization founded in the United States in 1968 by Rabbi Meir Kahane. The JDL aims to protect Jews from anti-Semitic attacks and promote Jewish pride and militancy, with the motto "Never Again," emphasizing the prevention of another Holocaust through militant self-defense. The JDL was established in response to rising anti-Semitism and perceived threats to Jewish communities, and initially focused on neighborhood patrols and self-defense training. They soon adopted direct action tactics targeting neo-Nazi groups, the Soviet Union, and black nationalists. They gained attention for its campaign against the Soviet Union's treatment of Jews, staging protests, sit-ins, and violent acts to draw attention to the Soviet Jewish dissidents. Their militant methods included bombings, arson, and assaults, and the leader, Meir Kahane, moved to Israel in 1971, founding the extremist Koch Party, which was later banned. He would then remain influential among right-wing extremists until his assassination in 1990. Despite his departure, the JDL continued its activities under new leaders, and in 2001, Irv Rubin and Earl Krugel were arrested for plotting to bomb Arab-American targets. Rubin died in custody and Krugel was murdered in prison, and these incidents weakened the JDL structure, but it remains active as a loosely organized network. Next up we have Earth First, and Earth First is a radical environmental advocacy group founded in the United States in 1980. The group emerged in reaction to perceived failures of mainstream environmentalism, adopting the slogan "No compromise in defense of Mother Earth" and committing to direct action and civil disobedience. Initially based in the southwestern United States, Earth First quickly gained national attention, focusing on preventing logging in old-growth forests, opposing dam constructions, and protecting wilderness areas. They're known for their direct action tactics, including tree spiking, road blockades, tree sitting, and sabotaging equipment, collectively referred to as ecotage or monkey wrenching. Throughout the 80s and 90s, they conducted numerous high-profile campaigns, particularly in the Pacific Northwest against ancient forest logging, and in the Southwest against uranium mining and desert development. They operate as a decentralized network, allowing local chapters to act autonomously while adhering to the broader principles of the movement. Despite facing challenges in the late 90s and early 2000s, with some members shifting to focus on climate change activism or joining more militant groups like the Earth Liberation Front, Earth First continues to advocate radical environmentalism and direct action. Alright, next up we have the Great Eastern Islamic Raiders Front, and this is a militant Islamist group in Turkey founded in the mid-1980s, and they advocate for an Islamic state governed by Sharia law and aim to revive the Ottoman Empire's glory. The group's tactics include bombings, assassinations, and armed attacks, targeting government officials, secular institutions, and symbols of Western influence. Despite Salih's multiple arrests, including a life sentence in 1998, he continued to influence the group from prison, and throughout the 2000s, Turkish counterterrorism efforts significantly weakened the group, reducing the frequency and severity of its acts. Despite condemnation from both the Turkish government and moderate Islamic groups, they remain a persistent, albeit slightly diminished threat in Turkey. Next up we have the Kamala Party of Iranian Kurdistan, also known as Kamala. They are a Kurdish political militant organization founded in the late 1960s. Inspired by Marxist-Leninist ideology, they sought autonomy and rights for Kurds within a socialist framework. The group emerged in response to political and economic marginalization under the Shah's rule, and the group focused on promoting Kurdish cultural rights and social justice through activism. After the 1979 Iranian Revolution, Kamala engaged in armed conflict with the new Islamic Republic regime, which opposed ethnic minority movements and Marxism. Throughout the 1980s, they conducted guerrilla warfare against the Iranian forces, aiming to weaken central control over Kurdish areas. The party established local councils to administer controlled regions, promoting services and political education. Challenges in the late 1980s and early 1990s, including Iranian military offensives, internal factionalism, and competition with other Kurdish groups, weakened Kamala, and the collapse of the Soviet Union further impacted the group's ideological appeal and support. By the 2000s and 2010s, Kamala maintained smaller-scale political and military activities with bases in Iraqi Kurdistan for training and operations. Alright, next up we have Sayar Era, meaning Free Ireland in Irish, and this was a Marxist-Leninist paramilitary organization in Ireland that emerged in the late 1960s. They aimed to establish a socialist republic through armed struggle, combining nationalist aspirations with Marxist revolutionary ideology. Founded by a mix of former IRA members and social activists, the group quickly adopted militant tactics, including armed robberies, bombings, and assassinations. One notable incident was a bank robbery in Dublin in 1970, intended to finance their activities, and they targeted financial institutions and symbols of the capitalist system, viewing them as oppressors of the Irish working class. Prominent figures like Seamus Costello shaped the group's ideology and strategy, promoting the need for a revolutionary vanguard, and they operated mainly in the Republic of Ireland, but also had connections with militants in Northern Ireland, aiming to support the broader Republican struggle against British rule. Disagreements and radical tactics also would eventually alienate potential supporters and created tensions with other Republican factions, and by the early 1970s, the group's influence had significantly diminished, leading to its disintegration, and many members joined other Republican organizations or left militant activism. Alright, next up we have the Zebra Killers, and the Zebra Killers were a group of serial killers responsible for racially motivated murders in San Francisco during the early 1970s. The term Zebra came from the police radio frequency used to investigate the crimes, and from 1973 to 1974, at least 15 people were killed, though some estimates as many as 73 victims. The murders, targeting primarily white victims, were linked to the Death Angels, an extremist faction associated with the Nation of Islam, although the Nation of Islam has denied any connection. The spree began on October of 1973 with the abduction and murder of Kita Haig and the attack of her husband, Richard Haig. The killings were often marked by brutality, involving shootings or machete attacks. The San Francisco Police Department faced challenges solving the crimes due to their random nature, and they formed a special task force, codenamed Zebra, to investigate. A breakthrough would come in April 1974 when Anthony Harris, former Death Angels member, provided information that led to the arrest of several suspects, including Manuel Moore, Larry Green, Jesse Lee Cooks, and JCX Simon. The trial, one of California's longest and most complex, began in 1975, and the prosecution relied on Harris's testimony, forensic evidence, and ballistic reports. In 1976, the defendants were convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. Alright, next up we have the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, or the PFLP, and they're a Marxist-Leninist and secular Palestinian nationalist organization established in 1967 by George Habash. Formed in response to the defeat of Arab armies in the Six-Day War, the group sought the liberation of Palestine through armed struggle and revolutionary principles. It quickly became the leading faction within the Palestine Liberation Organization, or PLO, advocating for a secular socialist state in place of Israel and opposing negotiations with the Israeli state. George Habash, the founder, shaped the group's ideological and operational strategies, combining Palestinian nationalism with revolutionary socialism, and they aimed to mobilize the Palestinian masses and engage in armed struggle against Israel and its allies. They would gain international notoriety for high-profile militant operations, including airplane hijackings and bombings, such as the hijacking of 4 airplanes in September 1970. Also known as Black September. The operational strategy also included guerrilla warfare and acts of international terrorism to draw global attention to the Palestinian cause. Their influence would, however, wane in the late 1980s and 1990s due to the rise of Islamist groups like Hamas and the decline of Soviet support. The 1993 Oslo Accords, opposed by the PFLP, marked a further decline in its influence. However, despite this, they continued their attacks into the 2000s. They have also participated in Palestinian politics, maintaining a presence in various institutions, and its political wing, the PFLP General Command, continues to uphold its ideological stance. Alright, moving on to Tier 4. And first off, we have the National Liberation Front of Corsica, and they are a militant nationalist group founded in the 1970s seeking independence from France through political activism and violent insurgency. Emerging from the historical tensions and economic disparities, the FLNC initially used bombings, arson, and assassinations to target French authorities and businesses. Despite internal divisions and French counterterrorism measures, they continued their campaign into the 1990s. However, in 2014, the group declared a ceasefire, shifting focus to political advocacy for greater autonomy, cultural recognition, and economic development. All right, next up we have the White Wolves, and the White Wolves is a British neo-Nazi group formed in the mid-1990s as a militant offshoot of Combat 18. They advocated for white supremacism, anti-Semitism, and xenophobia. Led by David Copeland, the group sought to incite racial hatred and violence through terror, most notably the 1999 London nail bombings targeting Black, South Asian, and LGBTQ+ communities, which resulted in 3 deaths and over 140 injuries. Copeland's arrest and subsequent sentences led to the group's decline, though it still continues as an underground network. All right, next up we have the Red Brigades, and the Red Brigades was a far-left Marxist-Leninist terrorist organization in Italy that operated primarily during the 1970s and 1980s. The group aimed to overthrow Italy's capitalist system and establish a dictatorship of the proletariat through armed struggle. Inspired by global revolutionary movements, the Red Brigades escalated from minor acts of vandalism to serious offensives, including arson, bombings, and kidnappings. Their most infamous act was the 1978 kidnapping and murder of former Prime Minister Aldo Moro, which marked their peak of influence and initiated their decline due to intensified government crackdowns and public outrage. Throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s, internal strife and leadership arrests further weakened the Red Brigades, leading to factionalism and a loss of centralized control. Despite continued attacks such as the assassination of General Carlo Alberto Dalla Chiesa and the kidnapping of U.S. Army General James L. Dozier, the group's operational capacity dwindled. By the mid-1980s, the Red Brigades had lost much of their support and relevance, and attempts to revive the group in the 1990s and 2000s were largely unsuccessful. And today, the Red Brigades are considered defunct, with their legacy symbolizing the violent extremism of Italy's years of lead. All right, next up we have the Ejército de Liberación Nacional, or National Liberation Army, or ELN, and they were a Marxist-Leninist guerrilla group in Colombia, active since 1964. Founded by radical Catholic priests and left-wing intellectuals, they aimed to overthrow the Colombian government and establish a social state. Influenced by liberation theology and the Cuban Revolution, the group engaged in guerrilla warfare, kidnapping, extortion, and attacks on infrastructure to further its revolutionary goals. Over the years, they established strongholds in various regions and financed its operations through involvement of illegal drug trade and other illicit activities. Despite numerous military offensives and peace negotiations, the ELN has remained resilient due to its decentralized structure and adaptability. Notable efforts for peace, including those initiated under President Juan Manuel Santos, faced setbacks due to ELN attacks such as the 2019 Bogota Police Academy bombing. Today, they continue to be a significant security threat in Colombia, with its involvement in drug trafficking and illegal mining sustaining its operations. All right, next up we have the Organisation Armée Secrète, or the OAS, and they were a far-right French paramilitary group formed in January of 1961 in opposition to Algerian independence. Led by disillusioned military officers and settlers, the OAS sought to maintain French rule in Algeria through a campaign of terrorism and assassination. Their activities targeted both the Algerian National Liberation Front and the French government, with notable incidents such as the 1962 attempted assassination of President Charles de Gaulle. And the group's violent tactics include bombings, shootings, and sabotage, resulting in significant casualties and widespread fear. The French government's counterterrorism measures, including increased security and aggressive operations, effectively weakened the OAS, and the signing of the Evian Accords in March 1962 ended the Algerian War and paved the way for Algerian independence, which further diminished the group's influence. Following Algeria's independence, on July 5, 1962, the OAS's operational capabilities declined rapidly, leading to its disbandment by the mid-1960s. All right, next up we have Tanzim, and Tanzim, meaning organization in Arabic, is a paramilitary group linked to the Fatah movement that emerged in the 1990s. Tanzim aimed to organize resistance and protection for Palestinian civilians. The group would coordinate protests, strikes, and armed attacks against Israeli targets. During the Second Intifada, they also played a prominent role, engaging in numerous violent attacks. The group's activities were seen as a part of broader strategy to pressure Israel for concessions, and following the arrest of their leader, Marwan, in 2002, Tanzim's influence waned, and today they are largely inactive, with historical significance remembered in the context of the Palestinian struggle for self-determination. Our next up, we had the Idealist Hearths, and the Idealist Hearths is a nationalist youth organization closely affiliated with the Nationalist Movement Party. Founded in the late 1960s in response of rising leftist movements, the group aimed to promote Turkish nationalism and the Turkish Islamic synthesis championed by Alparslan Turks. Known for their militant activities in the 1970s, members of the Idealist Hearths, often referred to as Grey Wolves, were implicated in numerous acts of political violence, including assassinations and bombings, contributing to the political unrest that led to the 1980 military coup in Turkey. Following the coup, the Idealist Hearths were severely weakened, but resurfaced in the 1980s with a focus on political and cultural advocacy. They maintained close ties with the Nationalist Movement Party and expanded their influence through educational and social activities. And in recent years, the group has remained active, promoting Turkish nationalism and opposing perceived threats to national unity. Our next up, we have the Earth Liberation Front, and the Earth Liberation Front, or ELF, is a radical environmental movement that emerged in the early 1990s, originating from the Earth First movement. Known for its use of direct action and eco-sabotage, ELF aims to combat environmental destruction and promote ecological preservation. The group's decentralized and leaderless structure has enabled it to carry out numerous high-profile attacks, including arson, vandalism, and sabotage, targeting industries such as logging, housing, and research. One significant action was a 1998 firebombing of Vail Resort's ski facility in Colorado, causing an estimated $12 million in damage. The group's tactics and ideology, rooted deep in ecology and biocentrism, emphasize the intrinsic value of all living beings and aim to force industries and governments to change their practices. Now, they remain a sporadic and significant threat, with its potential for violent actions and economic sabotage continuing to concern law enforcement and targeted industries, and while its visibility and frequency of actions have decreased, ELF's influence on the broader environmental movement underscores the complexity of addressing environmental issues through both legal and illegal means. Alright, next up we have the Order of the Nine Angles, and yeah, we kind of talked about them in the cult, but Order of the Nine Angles, or ONA, is a far-right neo-Nazi and satanic organization that emerged in the UK during the late 1960s and early 1970s. They combine elements of National Socialism, paganism, and anti-modernism with esoteric and occult practices, promoting a worldview centered on, quote, aeonics. The group seeks to usher in a new aeon called the Galactic Empire through acts of transgressive violence and the cultivation of an elite human type. Operating through a decentralized network of autonomous cells, they maintain a low public profile while spreading its influence internationally. The group's ideology has inspired violent extremism, leading to several high-profile criminal cases, such as the conviction of a British member, Ryan Fleming, for sexual assault, and the arrest of a U.S. Army soldier, Ethan Melzer, for plotting an ambush, influenced by ONA teachings. Alright, next up we have Ordine Nuovo, or New Order, and they were a far-right neo-fascist organization founded in Italy in 1956. Emerging from the fringes of post-World War II Italian politics, the group sought to revive fascist ideologies and counter communism, aiming to establish a neo-fascist state rooting in authoritarianism and nationalism. Initially formed as a radical alternative to the Italian social movement, the group engaged in political agitation, propaganda, and paramilitary operations, including bombings and assassinations. One of their most infamous acts was the Piazza Fontana bombing in 1969, which killed 17 people and marked the beginning of the, quote, years of lead, a period of heightened political violence in Italy. As we talked about. Throughout the 1970s, they continued their campaign, aiming to destabilize society and pave way for the fascist revolution. The Italian government would ban the group in 1973, but their influence persisted through clandestine operations and connections with other far-right entities. Trials and investigations into their activities were often controversial, highlighting allegations of state interference and cover-ups, and despite its disbandment, their legacy continues to impact far-right extremism in Italy and Europe, serving as a reminder of the dangers of political extremism, an ongoing need for vigilance in combating terrorism. Alright, next up we have the Socialist Revolutionary Combat Organization, or SRCO, and this was the militant arm of the Socialist Revolutionary Party in Russia that emerged in the early 1900s to counter increasing repression by the Tsarist regime. Founded by Grigory Gershuni in 1902, the group aimed to overthrow the monarchy and establish a socialist state through acts of terrorism and assassination. The SRCO carried out high-profile assassinations, including those of Interior Minister Dmitry Sipiagin and Prime Minister Master Pyotr Stolypin. Despite internal scandals, the group continued its violent campaign, significantly contributing to the revolutionary fervor of the early 20th century. The group played a notable role during the 1905 Russian Revolution and continued anti-Tsarist activities into World War I and the February Revolution of 1917. However, the rise of the Bolsheviks and the establishment of the Soviet secret police, the Cheka, led to the group's suppression by the early 1920s. Many members were arrested, executed, or exiled, effectively dismantling the organization. Alright, next up we have Forever Enduring Always Ready or FEAR. And FEAR was a domestic terrorist organization founded by U.S. Army soldiers based at Fort Stewart, Georgia in the early 2010s. FEAR aimed to overthrow the U.S. government through a campaign of terror and violence, seeking to establish a new political order based on extremist beliefs. They were involved in a series of violent incidents, including the murder of former soldier Michael Rourke and his girlfriend Tiffany York in December of 2011. Investigations into these murders revealed FEAR's broader conspiracy, uncovering a significant arsenal and detailed plans for attacks on government buildings, a dam in Washington state, and public officials. The subsequent arrests and prosecutions of key members highlighted the dangerous potential of radicalized individuals within the military. Next up we have Seleka, and Seleka is a coalition of predominantly Muslim rebel groups in the Central African Republic that emerged in late 2012 to overthrow President Francois Bozize. The coalition formed in response to the marginalization of the northeastern Central African Republic regions and united several rebel factions, including the CPJP, UFDR, and CPSK under the leadership of Michel Dutodea. Seleka's rapid military campaign led to the capture of the capital, Bangui, in March of 2013, with Michel declaring himself president. However, Seleka's rule was marked by severe violence, looting, and human rights abuses, escalating sectarian tensions and leading to the formation of Christian anti-Balaka militias. Michel would resign in January of 2014 under international pressure, leading to a transitional government and eventually the election of Faustin Archange Touadera in 2016. Despite these efforts, Seleka fragmented into various factions, creating a complex and volatile security situation to this day. Alright, next up we have the Charles Martel Group, and the Charles Martel Group, named after the Frankish military leader who defeated Muslim forces at the Battle of Tours in 732, was a far-right anti-immigrant terrorist organization active in France during the 1970s and 1980s. Composed of radical nationalists, the group sought to counter what they perceived as a, quote, Muslim invasion of France. Inspired by Charles Martel, the group viewed themselves as defenders of European Christian civilization and engaged in violent attacks including bombings, arson, and assaults targeting immigrants, left-wing activists, and institutions supporting multiculturalism. Their clandestine cell-based structure made it difficult for law enforcement to dismantle them, allowing them to operate for several years. The group is now seen as a historical example of far-right terrorism in Europe, with their legacy influencing contemporary extremist movements to this day. Alright, next up we have the Wagner Group, and the Wagner Group is a private military company known for its involvement in global conflicts, often serving the strategic interests of the Russian government. Founded around 2014 by Dmitry Utkin, the group gained prominence during the annexation of Crimea and the conflict in eastern Ukraine. Wagner operatives have since expanded their operations to the Middle East, particularly Syria, supporting the Assad regime, and to several countries including Libya, Sudan, the Central African Republic, and Mozambique, providing security, training, and protecting valuable resources. Financed by Yevgeny Prigozhin, who is a Russian oligarch with close ties to Vladimir Putin, and yeah, he just recently died in a plane crash in August of 2023. There was also a perceived Wagner, revolution where they splintered off against Russia during this whole Ukrainian conflict. I mean, there's not much to know about them other than the fact that their leaders keep dying. It's ironic that the leaders Dmitry Utkin and Valery Chekalov and Prigozhin all died in a plane crash, likely caused by an explosion on board, and was widely suspected that the Russian state was involved. But yeah, they're still operating in Ukraine to this day. So, I mean, all right, moving on to tier 5. Yeah. Alright, next up we have RARA, and RARA, or Revolutionary Anti-Racist Action, was a Dutch militant left-wing organization active during the 1980s and 1990s, known for its radical approach to combating racism and promoting leftist ideologies through violent means. Emerging from the broader anti-racist and anti-fascist movements in Western Europe, RARA's activities included bombings and sabotage targeting government institutions and multinational corporations linked to racism and colonialism. Notable attacks included the bombings of immigrant Immigration and Naturalization Service headquarters and the macro supermarket chain. While RARA's militant tactics highlighted significant social issues, they also drew criticism for undermining their cause and alienating potential allies. Increased police efforts and internal divisions led to the group's decline by the mid-1990s, and today RARA is considered inactive, and its legacy is studied as a part of the history of militant activism and political extremism. Alright, next up we have the Antipodean Resistance, or AR, and they are a neo-Nazi and white supremacist organization formed in Australia in 2016, known for its provocative and offensive propaganda promoting an extremist ideology that advocates for a white ethno-state and exclusion or elimination of non-white populations. Operating with a decentralized and anonymous structure, AR has engaged in activities such as defacing public property with Nazi symbols, distributing racist and homophobic propaganda at schools and universities, and harassing minority communities. The group's materials often reference Nazi imagery and slogans calling for a white-only Australia and the violent removal of Jews, LGBTQ+ individuals, and other minorities. Despite law enforcement's efforts to monitor and curb AR's influence, the group's clandestine nature poses significant challenges. Their international networking with other far-right groups and potential for radicalization and violence associated with their ideology remain serious concerns to this day. Next up we have the Nationalist Party of Puerto Rico, and they were founded in 1922, and they advocated for the island's independence for the United States. Emerging from growing discontent with American rule post-1898, the party positioned themselves as a leading voice for sovereignty. Under the charismatic leadership of Pedro Albizu Campos from 1930, the party adopted radical strategies including protests, strikes, and direct action. The 1930s and 40s saw significant clashes with U.S. authorities, most notably the Rio Piedras massacre in 1935. The peak of the party's militancy came in the late 1940s and early 1950s with the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party revolts, an assassination attempt on President Harry S. Truman in 1950, which led to the suppression of uprisings and imprisonment of leaders like Albizu Campos. Despite continued advocacy in the 1950s and 60s, the party's influence waned as other political movements gained prominence, and Campos was released from prison in 1964 but died in 1965. Next up we have the Conspiracy of Fire Nuclei, or CCF, and they are a militant anarchist organization that originated in Greece in 2008. They employed direct action and violent tactics to challenge the state, capitalism, and authority, carrying out bombings, arson, and sabotage against government buildings, financial institutions, and capitalist symbols. Initially gaining attention with arson attacks on luxury car dealerships in Athens, the CCF intensified its activities during the 2008 financial crisis, targeting police stations, banks, and government offices. The group's decentralized structure, consisting of autonomous cells, has made it difficult for law enforcement to dismantle it. Although significant arrests have been made, the CCF continues to inspire and collaborate with militant anarchist organizations worldwide, maintaining a commitment to global anarchist struggle against capitalism and state authority. Next up we have the Order of the Assassins, and this was a militant sect of the Shia Islam founded in the late 11th century by Hassan Sabah. Known for their strategic use of targeted assassinations, the assassins aim to achieve political and religious objectives from their impregnable stronghold at Alamut in northern Persia. The assassins meticulously infiltrated and eliminated political and religious enemies, gaining a reputation of ruthlessness and unwavering dedication. Their network of fortresses across Persia and Syria allowed them to exert significant influence during periods of political turmoil, including the Crusades. Their decline began in the mid-13th century with the Mongol invasions led by Hulagu Khan, who targeted and dismantled their strongholds, including Alamut. Despite their military defeat, the legacy of the assassins endured through myths and lasting impact of their tactics on the concept of politically motivated murder. Next up we have the Australian Nationalist Movement, and the Australian Nationalist Movement, or ANM, was a far-right political organization founded in the late 1980s by Jack van Tongeren, who was a Dutch-born Australian veteran of the Vietnam War. The ANM promoted extreme nationalism, racism, and anti-immigration sentiments, advocating for white-only Australia and the expulsion of non-white immigrants, particularly Asians. The group became notorious for its campaign of racist violence, including firebombing Asian-owned businesses and distributing hate-filled propaganda. Jack and several other members would be arrested in 1989, leading to his conviction and an 18-year prison sentence in 1990, which significantly weakened the group. Despite attempts by Jack to revive the ANM after his release, the group's influence dwindled, though its ideology persisted among elements of the Australian far right. Next up we have the Nuclei Armati Rivoluzionari, or NAR. and this was a neo-fascist terrorist organization active in Italy during the late 1970s and early 1980s, through a period known as the Years of Lead, as we talked about. It was founded in 1977 by radical right-wing militants disillusioned with the traditional Italian social movement, and they sought to overthrow the democratic government, establish a neo-fascist state, and eradicate leftist ideologies. The group's most notorious attack was the 1980 Bologna Central Railway Station bombing, which killed 85 people and injured over 200, marking one of the deadliest terror attacks in Italian history. More of their activities included bombings, assassinations, robberies, and armed assaults, targeting political opponents, law enforcement, judges, and journalists. The Italian government's intensified surveillance and police action eventually led to the arrest and prosecution of many of the members, including their leaders, which eventually led to the group's disintegration by the mid-1980s. Alright, next up we have Alfaro Vive Carajo, or the AVC, and this is a left-wing guerrilla movement in Ecuador founded in 1983 by young intellectuals and political activists. The AVC aimed to overthrow the Ecuadorian government and establish a socialist state through armed struggle. The group was initially focused on raising awareness, building support, but quickly turned to violence, with their first major act being an attack on a police station in Quito in 1984. Throughout the mid-1980s, they carried out bank robberies, kidnappings, and bombings, targeting government installations and financial institutions, with one of the most significant incidents being the kidnapping of banker Nahim Isaias in 1985, which ended in a violent confrontation and his death, leading to increased government crackdowns on the group. By the late 1980s, AVC's operational capabilities were significantly weakened due to severe government responses, including the deaths and arrests of key leaders. In the 1990s, AVC shifted from armed struggle to political participation, with many former members joining mainstream political parties and social movements, and today AVC is largely inactive as an armed group, focusing instead on progressive policies through non-violent means. Alright, next up we have Nakam, and Nakam, also known as the Avengers, was a Jewish paramilitary organization formed in 1945 by Holocaust survivor Abba Kovner and a group of fellow survivors. The group's primary mission was to exact retribution against Nazis and collaborators responsible for the Holocaust. They planned and executed several clandestine operations across Europe. One of Nakam's most ambitious plans aimed to kill 6 million Germans by poisoning the water supplies of major German cities, but it was abandoned due to logistical and ethical concerns. Instead, they shifted to, quote, Plan B, targeting Nazi war criminals in Allied detention camps, notably poisoning the bread supply at Stalag 13, a POW camp near Nuremberg in 1946, causing widespread illness among former SS officers and Nazi officials. By the late 1940s, Nakam's activities waned as its members faced increasing pressure from international authorities and the State of Israel. Many former resistance fighters, including Kovner, shifted their focus to building and defending the new Jewish state, and today they are viewed as a historical example of post-Holocaust retribution and the complexities of justice following such atrocities. Next up we have the Gulen Movement, and the Gulen Movement, also known as FETO or Fethullah Terrorist Organization, is an Islamic transnational social movement led by the Turkish cleric Fethullah Gulen. Founded in the 1960s, the movement promotes a moderate interpretation of Islam, emphasizing education, interfaith dialogue, and community service. By the 1980s and 1990s, it expanded internationally, establishing a vast network of schools, universities, and cultural centers in over 140 countries. Initially, the movement supported the ruling Justice and Development Party, but tensions grew, culminating in the 2016 failed coup, which the Turkish government blamed on Gulen and his followers. This led to extensive purges within Turkey and a global campaign against the movement. And today, FETO is considered a terrorist organization by the Turkish government, with its activities facing severe scrutiny and pressure both domestically and internationally. Alright, next up we have the Coordinadora Araco Meleco, or CAM. They were a militant Mapuche indigenous organization in Chile, founded in 1998 to advocate for the rights of the Mapuche people. Emerging from historical grievances and marginalization, CAM adopts direct action tactics such as land occupations, sabotage, and confrontations with police and the forestry companies. The group's key demand is the return of ancestral lands taken by the state and private entities. Their decentralized leadership allows flexibility but complicates negotiations with the state. The organization's activities have led to violent clashes and mixed reactions, with supporters arguing for their right to reclaim lands and critics labeling them as terrorists. They remain a significant force in the struggle for Mapuche rights, posing a challenge to the Chilean government and business interests in the Araucania region. Next up we have the Action Direct, or AD, and this was a French far-left terrorist organization active from 1979 until its dismantling in 1987. Formed from the merger of the Internationalist Communist Organization and the Armed Nucleus for Popular Autonomy, AD sought to overthrow the French government and capitalist system to establish a revolutionary communist society. The group engaged in bombings, assassinations, and armed robberies, targeting state representatives, military-industrial entities, and multinational corporations. The French government's counterterrorism efforts, intensified surveillance, and coordinated raids culminated in the 1987 arrest of key AD members, effectively dismantling the organization. Alright, next up we have Shindo Renmei, or the League of the Way of Emperors, and this was a militant Japanese-Brazilian organization active during the 1940s. Formed by Japanese immigrants and their descendants, the group aimed to support the Japanese Empire during World War II and maintain loyalty to the Japanese Emperor. Emerging in response to discrimination and economic difficulties faced by Japanese community in Brazil, Shindo Renmei was founded in 1942 by radical elements who refused to accept Japan's defeat. The group divided the Japanese Brazilian community into the Kachi-gumi, or victory group, and Make-gumi, the defeat group, targeting the latter with violence for acknowledging Japan's defeat. Between 1945 and 1946, Shindo Renmei was responsible for at least 23 deaths and numerous attacks. The Brazilian government response included a series of police raids in 1946, leading to the arrest of over 400 suspected members and the prosecution of its leaders. The dismantling of the group ended its violent campaign, but left a lasting impact on the Japanese Brazilian community, fostering a period of introspection and reconciliation. Alright, next up we have the Nordic Resistance Movement, or the NRM, and this is a far-right neo-Nazi organization founded in 1997 by Klaus Lund, primarily operating in Sweden with active chapters in Norway, Finland, Denmark, and Iceland. They advocate for a pan-Nordic nationalist state and the expulsion of non-European immigrants and an ethnically homogenous society based on nationalist socialist principles. Known for its violent rhetoric, anti-Semitic and racist ideology, and paramilitary activities, the NRM has been involved in numerous violent incidents, including assaults on immigrants and political opponents. The hierarchical structure and clandestine operations involve both public demonstrations and illegal activities, and members undergo paramilitary training, preparing for what they believe to be is an impending racial war. Despite facing significant legal challenges, including a ban in Finland following the death of an anti-fascist activist in 2016, the NRM continues to operate, often rebranding to circumvent legal restrictions. Internationally, they maintain connections with other far-right organizations, enhancing its ability to sustain activities and broaden its influence. Next up we have the 1st of October anti-fascist resistance groups, and this was a Marxist-Leninist terrorist organization in Spain, founded in 1975 as a militant wing of the reconstituted Communist Party of Spain. The group aimed to establish a proletarian dictatorship through armed struggle against the Spanish state, opposing the transition of Franco's dictatorship to democracy. Influenced by Maoist and Leninist principles, the group carried out assassinations, bombings, kidnappings, and bank robberies, targeting government officials, police, military personnel, and businessmen. They operated through a decentralized network, making it difficult for law enforcement to infiltrate. However, the group's influence waned due to declining resources and the changing political climate, and by the mid-2000s, the group was largely inactive, and their remaining members were either imprisoned or had abandoned the armed struggle. Alright, moving on to Tier 6. Next up we have the Sea Shepherd Conservation Society, or the SSCS, and this is an international nonprofit marine conservation organization founded in 1977 by Paul Watson. Dedicated to protecting marine wildlife, SSCS focuses on combating illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, whaling, and other threats to marine ecosystems through direct action tactics. The organization's first significant campaign against the Canadian seal hunt in 1978 set the tone for its bold and confrontational operations worldwide, including high-profile campaigns against whaling fleets from Japan, Norway, and Iceland. They operate a fleet of vessels known as Neptune's Navy to intercept illegal fishing operations and document environmental crimes using advanced technology like drones. Despite facing legal challenges, accusations of piracy, and eco-terrorism, the group has influenced international policy changes such as Japan's temporary suspension of its Antarctic whaling program in 2014. And today, Sea Shepherd remains a polarizing yet influential force in marine conservation. Alright, next up we have the People's Self-Defense, and this is a Russian nationalist paramilitary organization that emerged in the mid-2000s. Known for its far-right ideology, the group advocates for Russian nationalism, anti-immigrant sentiments, and opposes the Russian government, which it perceives as corrupt and ineffective. The organization, led by figures like Alexander Potkin, engages in violent actions. The group has targeted immigrants, ethnic minorities, and political adversaries through attacks, vandalism, and violent demonstrations. And despite government repression and arrests, they remain resilient and maintain a significant presence in Russia's nationalist landscape. Alright, next up we have the Network, and the Network, or SET, is a controversial and secretive organization in Russia, described by the Russian authorities as a terrorist network aiming to overthrow the government through violent means. Allegedly founded in 2015, the group is said to have operated cells in several cities, including Penza, St. Petersburg, and Moscow, with connections to anarchist and anti-fascist movements. It came to public attention in 2017 when the FSB arrested several young activists, accusing them of plotting terrorist attacks during the 2018 presidential election and the FIFA World Cup. The accused were charged with forming a terrorist community and planning attacks, and they denied the charges, claiming the evidence was fabricated and that they were tortured into confessing. The case has since sparked significant domestic and international outcry, with human rights organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch condemning the arrests and trials as politically motivated efforts to suppress dissent. Alright, next up we have Comité Régional d'Action Viticole, or CRAV, and this is a militant organization based in a region of southern France. Formed in the early 1970s by disaffected local wine growers, CRAV emerged in response to economic pressures, including competition from foreign wine imports and inadequate government support. The group is known for its aggressive tactics such as sabotage, arson, and threats aimed at protecting the interests of local producers. CRAV's leadership remains anonymous, operating through a decentralized structure that has allowed it to sustain militant activities over the decades, and their campaigns have drawn significant attention to the struggles of the local wine industry. Alright, next up we have the GTA Gang, and the GTA Gang, named after the video game Grand Theft Auto, was a notorious criminal organization operating in Russia from 2012 to 2014, primarily in the Moscow region. Composed of young immigrants from Central Asia, the gang became infamous for brutal highway robberies and murders. Their methods of operation involved setting up roadblocks with spike metal bars to immobilize vehicles, followed by ambushing and executing motorists to steal valuables. The gang's highly coordinated, decentralized structure allowed them to evade capture and instill widespread fear among motorists. The turning point came in November 2014 when Russian police conducted raids that resulted in a gunfight, leading to the death of the alleged leader and the capture of key members. The investigation revealed that the gang was primarily motivated by financial gain rather than ideological reasons, and in 2016, several members were convicted and sentenced to lengthy prison terms, effectively dismantling the gang. Alright, next up we got Comando Vermelho, or the Red Command, and this is one of Brazil's most notorious criminal organizations, primarily involved in drug trafficking, arms smuggling, and other illegal activities. Founded in the early 1970s in Rio de Janeiro's Cândido Mendes prison, the group emerged from an alliance between common criminals and left-wing political prisoners. This unique blend of organizational skills and ruthlessness enabled the Red Command to grow rapidly within the prison system and extend its influence to Rio's favelas. The group is known for its extreme violence, social control within favelas, and ongoing turf wars with rival gangs. Today, they remain a major threat to public security in Brazil, and its deep-rooted presence in the favelas and control over key drug trafficking routes make it a formidable force. Alright, next up we have the Justice Commandos of the Armenian Genocide, or JCAG, and this was an Armenian militant operation active from the mid-1970s to the mid-1980s. They were formed to seek justice and recognition for the Armenian Genocide. Founded in 1975 and closely associated with the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, the group targeted Turkish diplomats and officials whom they held responsible for denying the genocide, and their tactics included high-profile assassinations and bombings. They operated in various territories, including Europe, North America, and the Middle East, and was composed of highly motivated young Armenians from the diaspora, who are also well trained in guerrilla warfare and explosives. By the mid-1980s, JCAG's activities declined due to increased security measures, international law enforcement cooperation, and internal challenges, and today they are viewed as a historical example of radical activism driven by the Armenians diaspora's quest for justice. Alright, next up we have the Boatmen of Thessaloniki, who were a Bulgarian anarchist group active between 1900 and 1903 as a part of the broader Macedonian Revolution movement against the Ottoman Empire. Comprised of boatmen and dock workers, the group aimed for Macedonian autonomy or independence through radical and violent means, inspired by anarchist and socialist ideologies. The boatmen carried out a series of bombings and attacks in 1903, targeting Ottoman infrastructure and public buildings to undermine authority and draw international attention to their cause. The group's actions highlighted the desperation and radicalization of the Macedonian Revolutionary movement movement and drew international attention to the plight of Macedonians under Ottoman rule. Alright, next up we have the Action Group Against Free Mountain Hunting, and this was an environmental and animal rights organization active in the French Alps during the late 1990s and early 2000s. Formed in response to concerns about the impact of hunting on the wildlife and ecosystems, this group aimed to end or restrict hunting practices deemed unsustainable. Comprised of environmental activists, animal rights advocates, and local residents, the group used direct action tactics such as sabotaging hunting equipment and facilities and public demonstrations to disrupt hunting activities or draw attention to the cause. Alright, next up we have the Azanian People's Liberation Army, or the APLA, and this was the military wing of the Pan-Africanist Congress, or PAC. They were established in 1968 to wage an armed struggle against apartheid in South Africa. The group emphasized African nationalism and sought to overthrow the apartheid regime through guerrilla warfare tactics, and the group targeted government buildings, security forces, and collaborators operating both within South Africa and from bases in neighboring countries. Notable operations included the 1992 attack on the King Williamstown Golf Club and the 1993 St. James Church massacre. The eventual transition to democracy in the early 1990s saw the group agree to a ceasefire, with many of its members integrating into South African National Defense Force or reintegrating into civilian life. Alright, next up we have the American Indian Movement, or AIM, and this is a grassroots advocacy group founded in 1968 in Minneapolis, Minnesota. The organization was formed in response to systemic issues affecting Native Americans such as poverty, police brutality, high unemployment, poor housing, and inadequate healthcare. AIM's mission expanded to include the preservation of a Native American culture and traditions and the reclamation of lands and rights guaranteed by treaties with the U.S. government. They gained national prominence through high-profile actions like the 1969 occupation of Alcatraz Island, the 1972 Trail of Broken Treaties, and the 1973 occupation of Wounded Knee, which became symbols of Native American resistance and demands for justice and sovereignty. Throughout the 1970s, they advocated for Native American rights through direct action, legal challenges, and while their confrontational tactics often led to conflict with authorities, their efforts significantly raised awareness of Native American issues and secured legal victories affirming Native rights and sovereignty. In the 1980s and beyond, AIM shifted towards cultural preservation, education, and legal advocacy. Alright, next up we got the Women's Social and Political Union, or WSPU, and this was a British women's suffrage organization founded in 1903. Frustrated by the slow progress of the women's suffrage movement, this group adopted militant tactics under the slogan, "Deeds, not words." The group organized public demonstrations, acts of civil disobedience, and property damage, including window smashing campaigns and arson attacks, to draw attention to their cause. These actions often led to the arrest and imprisonment of their members, who would then undertake hunger strikes, prompting forcible feeding and public outcry. Despite the controversial nature of their tactics, this group's effort brought unprecedented attention to the women's suffrage movement, significantly contributing to the eventual granting of voting rights to women over 30 in 1918 and full suffrage in 1928. Alright, next up we have Rote Zara, and this was a radical feminist militant organization active in West Germany from the mid-1970s to the early 1990s. Emerging from the broader left-wing political landscape, the group was initially part of the revolutionary cells, but eventually became autonomous with a distinct feminist agenda. The group aimed to address social injustices affecting women. Frustrated by the male-dominated leftist movements at the time, the clandestine membership carried out bombings, arson attacks, and sabotage against institutions and businesses they deemed oppressive to women and exploitative. Despite intense surveillance by law enforcement, including the Federal Criminal Police Office, the group largely evaded capture due to their effective clandestine tactics. And the group's last known action occurred in 1995 with the bombing of a deportation facility construction site in Berlin. Next up we have the Squamish Five, and the Squamish Five, also known as the Vancouver Five or Direct Action, was a Canadian leftist militant group active in the early 1980s, composed of Ann Hansen, Brent Taylor, Julie Belmas, Jerry Hanna, and Doug Stewart. The group opposed corporate greed, environmental destruction, and state oppression, drawing on anarchist, anti-capitalist, and eco-activist ideologies. Their notable actions included the 1982 bombing of Lytton Industries in Toronto, targeting its involvement in cruise missile guidance systems, which resulted in injuries and widespread condemnation. They also firebombed red-hot video stores selling violent pornography, and even a hydroelectric substation to protest against environmental damage caused by dams. programs. Their final major action was the bombing of the British Columbia Ministry of Environment and Resource Management office in 1983, and they would be apprehended in January of 1983 near Squamish, British Columbia. The group's legacy remains controversial, viewed by some as radical activists driven by urgent issues, while others see them as misguided idealists resorting to unacceptable violence. Alright, next up we got Tier 7. Yeah. Alright, next up we have the Green Brigade, and this was a militant environmentalist organization active during the 1980s and 1990s, known for its radical approach to environmental activism through direct action tactics such as sabotage, arson, and vandalism. Formed in response to the growing environmental consciousness of the 1970s and 1980s, the group believed conventional methods were insufficient to address urgent environmental threats. Inspired by groups like Earth First and the Animal Liberation Front, the Green Brigade operated with a decentralized and anonymous structure, which allowed individual cells to act independently without adhering to shared principles. Their notable actions included the destruction of logging equipment, the sabotage of construction sites, and attacks on polluting factories, aiming to disrupt harmful activities. And while their tactics brought them into conflict with local communities and authorities, resulting in arrests and severe legal consequences, their legacy still remains controversial to this day. Alright, next up we have the 1989 California Medfly attacks, or the Breeders. And this was a significant bioterrorism attack involving the deliberate release of Mediterranean fruit flies to protest the state's agricultural policies and pest control measures. The Breeders released thousands of medflies in various locations, including Los Angeles and Orange counties, to create new infestations and challenge the state's use of pesticides. This act led to substantial economic costs as the California Department of Food and Agriculture intensified its pest control efforts, expanding the controversial aerial spraying program. Despite extensive investigations by the FBI and CDFA, the group's members and leadership remain unidentified, contributing to an enigmatic legacy. Alright, next up we have the Angry Brigade, and this was a British militant anarchist group active from the late 1960s to the early 1970s, known for a series of bombings and direct actions against government buildings, corporate offices, and political figures. Influenced by the global rise of radical leftist ideologies and movements, the group emerged from the political and social turmoil of the 1960s. Their actions, aimed at opposing the Vietnam War, capitalism, and state repression, were characterized by the use of homemade bombs designed to cause property damage rather than casualties. Notable attacks included the bombing of the Post Office Tower and British Army Recruitment Center in 1971. The British government's response led to the arrest of several members during a raid in 1971, culminating in the Stoke Newington 8 trial, one of the longest in British history, and 4 members were convicted and sentenced to prison. Alright, next up we have the Mountaineer Militia, and this was a right-wing extremist group based in West Virginia, founded in the mid-1990s by Floyd Ray Looker, and the group emerged as a part of a broader anti-government militia movement that gained momentum following events like the Ruby Ridge standoff and the Waco siege, which fueled fears of federal overreach and threats to Second Amendment rights. Under Looker's leadership, the militia conducted paramilitary training and survival skills sessions, preparing members for what they perceived as potential government tyranny. The militia's activities were largely centered in the Appalachian region and involved covert meetings and training exercises to avoid law enforcement detection. In 1996, the FBI arrested Looker and several members after uncovering a plot to bomb the FBI's national fingerprint records in Clarksburg, West Virginia, and the resulting trial and convictions of Looker and his associates highlighted the dangers posed by such extremist groups and their willingness to resort to violence. Next up we have the Primeiro Comando de Capital, or the PCC, and this is one of Brazil's largest and most powerful criminal organizations that was founded in 1993. Initially formed to protect prisoners' rights, the PCC rapidly expanded into various criminal enterprises such as drug trafficking, arms smuggling, and extortion. PCC has developed a highly organized and hierarchical structure, extending its influence beyond Sao Paulo to other regions in Brazil and into South America, including Paraguay and Bolivia. The group controls significant portions of cocaine trade and is known for its violent methods, including engaging in brutal conflicts with rival gangs. Their most notorious action was the 2006 Mega Rebellion, which was a series of coordinated attacks in Sao Paulo that resulted in over 150 deaths and highlighted their capacity for large-scale violence. Despite increased law enforcement efforts, the group has continued to demonstrate resilience and adaptability, complicating attempts to dismantle the organization. Alright, next up we have Nova Al-Qaeda, and this is a notorious criminal organization in Brazil, primarily in Rio de Janeiro's favela since the early 2010s. The group, inspired by Al-Qaeda in its name, is known for its extreme violence, drug trafficking, armed robberies, and confrontations with law enforcement. and rival gangs. It emerged as a splinter faction from larger criminal organizations like the Red Command and the Friends of Friends, with disenchanted members forming their own control over drug routes and territories. And the group maintains a secretive and hierarchical structure, using sophisticated weaponry and brutal tactics to assert dominance. Their influence extends beyond Rio de Janeiro, marked by significant violent incidents such as the 2016 coordinated attacks on police and rival gangs. And despite intensified police operations aimed at destabilizing the group, Nova Al-Qaeda remains resilient, largely due to its decentralized structure and recruitment from impoverished communities, offering financial incentives and a sense of belonging. All right, next up we have the United States. And I don't really know how to I don't really know how to go about this one. I mean, so like viewing the United States as a terrorist organization from the perspective of the British Empire would be like, you know, a thing, as like, you know, the revolutionaries use guerrilla warfare, including ambushes and hit and run tactics, and targeted British loyalists through intimidation and violence. They also conducted symbolic attacks like the Boston Tea Party, stuff like that. But if you want to go as far as to say like present day, maybe CIA, yeah, we'll get into that. Alright, next up we have Art Podgotovka, also known as Art Preparation, and this is a radical anti-government group in Russia founded in the mid-2010s. Vyacheslav Maltsev, who was a former regional parliament member and prominent opposition figure. Driven by his disillusionment with the Russian political system and desire for revolutionary change, he used his popular YouTube channel to advocate for people's revolution against President Vladimir Putin. His most notable attempt was the planned revolution on November 5th, 2017, which was thwarted by preemptive government crackdowns, resulting in numerous arrests and Maltsev fleeing Russia. Despite the failure of their planned revolution and subsequent suppression, the group remains a symbol of political dissent within Russia. Next up we have the Covenant, the Sword, and the Arm of the Lord, or CSA, and this was a far-right militant organization in the United States that operated from the 1970s to mid-1980s. Founded by James Ellison in 1971, the group established a survivalist commune near the Arkansas-Missouri border, promoting Christian identity theology, which was a racist interpretation of Christianity. Ellison, a charismatic leader, urged followers to prepare for an apocalyptic race war, leading to a heavily fortified compound and series of criminal activities, including armed robberies and weapons trafficking. The group's most notable incident was a 1985 standoff with federal agents, resulting in the peaceful surrender of Ellison and several key members. Ellison was sentenced to 20 years in prison, and the group's compound was seized, effectively dismantling the CSA. Alright, moving on to Tier 8. Yeah. Next up we have Up Against the Wall Motherfuckers. And Up Against the Wall Motherfuckers, or simply known as the Motherfuckers, was an anarchist group active in New York City during the late 1960s. Founded in 1966, the group emerged from the countercultural and radical political movements of the era, characterized by protests against the Vietnam War and civil rights activism. They sought to merge radical political action with the countercultural movement, using direct action and theatrical tactics to challenge the status quo, and their activities in the Lower East Side ranged from organizing free concerts and distributing food to the homeless to more confrontational actions such as squatting in vacant buildings and clashing with police. They also played a significant role in the 1967 Pentagon March against the Vietnam War and disrupted events to protest commercialization and commodification. Despite their radicalism and influential actions, internal conflicts and increasing police repression led to their decline and disintegration by the early 1970s. Alright, next up we got Operation Northwoods, and yeah, this is kind of like, you know, you could kind of replace this with CIA. But anyways, Operation Northwoods was a proposed covert operation developed in 1962 by the United States Department of Defense and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The plan aimed to justify U.S. military intervention in Cuba by staging false flag terrorist attacks that would be blamed on the Cuban government. Scenarios included hijacking and bombing civilian aircraft, sinking boats carrying Cuban refugees, and attacking U.S. military installations to create public outrage and international condemnation of Cuba. Conceived amid Cold War tensions and following Fidel Castro's alignment with the Soviet Union, the plan was detailed in a document titled Justification for U.S. Military Intervention in Cuba, but was ultimately rejected by President John F. Kennedy. Despite never being implemented, the revelation of Operation Northwoods in the 1990s through declassified documents sparked significant controversy and ethical debates about the use of false flag operations and manipulation of public opinion, and illustrates the lengths in which some U.S. military leaders were willing to go to counter perceived threats from communist regimes. Alright, next up we got the Witwoe, or the White Wolves, and this was a white supremacist paramilitary group in South Africa active during the late 1980s and early 1990s. Founded by Colonel Jan Breitenbach, a former SADF officer, the group aimed to resist the end of apartheid through violent means. Comprising former military personnel and police officers, the White Wolves engaged in terrorism, including bombings, assassinations, and sabotage, targeting anti-apartheid activists, ANC members, and symbols of democratic transition. One notable attack was the 1987 bombing of the Johannesburg's Magistrates Court, and despite their efforts, the group failed to prevent the 1994 democratic elections and the end of apartheid, which significantly weakened their influence. Law enforcement's successful infiltration of the group and prosecution of key members further diminished their capabilities, leading to their disintegration. Alright, next up we have the Columbine effect, and this is a term coined after the Columbine High School massacre on April 20th, 1999, and describes the influence of this tragic event on subsequent acts of school violence and mass shootings. Now, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold meticulously planned and executed the attack before committing suicide, and the extensive media coverage of their actions inadvertently contributed to the notoriety of the shooters, inspiring subsequent perpetrators who wanted to seek similar infamy. Include the Virginia Tech shooting in 2007, the Sandy Hook Elementary shooting in 2012, and many others. In response to such massacres, schools across the United States have implemented stricter security measures, and law enforcement revised active shooter protocols to prioritize immediate intervention. These such events have also sparked important discussions about media responsibility and reporting mass violence, and the need for comprehensive mental health services at school, and maybe even stricter gun regulations in the United States. Alright, last but not least, we have the Bowling Green massacre, and this gained notoriety due to a misstatement made by Kellyanne Conway, a senior advisor to President Donald Trump, during a 2017 interview. Conway referenced the non-existent massacre to justify Trump's executive order on immigration, and she likely meant to refer to the 2011 arrest of 2 Iraqi nationals in Bowling Green, Kentucky, attempting to provide material support to terrorists. However, her misstatement quickly became a focal point of media scrutiny and public ridicule, highlighting the role of misinformation in public discourse. All right, and yeah, that's it. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope I did it well. I haven't made a video and it's been a while. Yeah, some of these are like legit terrorist organizations, and some of these are just, you know, people trying to get like voting rights and shit. But yeah, it's been a minute. I hope you guys are doing well, and yeah, I guess I'm gonna catch you in the next one. I love you, bro.